It was just another clear day at one of the city's construction sites. Work was in full swing. One of the workers, a young dark-haired guy named Tony, got a message on his phone. It said that he didn't make the cut again at one of the companies. Turns out he had the right skills, but they had hiring limits, so he couldn't get through the interview. Just then, someone called out to Tony, making him shut his phone. Turns out it was his buddy John, asking if Tony was playing mobile games again instead of working. Tony quickly hid his phone and tried to look innocent, saying he had finished his work and now had nothing to do. John skeptically asked him why a guy who's only been on the team for a year was doing so well, but something didn't quite respond to him, mentioning he's been doing this since he finished school. He had told him about it when they were at the bar. He smirked, saying that John's memory gets wiped every time they go drinking, and John wasn't too pleased with that response. Then Tony climbed up the ladder, started painting the walls, saying that John could take a break and have a smoke while he finishes up. At that moment, Tony felt a sudden, strange sensation, and John noticed it and asked what was wrong. Tony immediately grabbed his back, but insisted he was fine, although his whole body kept shaking. He thought to himself that his painkillers probably stopped working. Turns out, due to the heavy lifting at work, his back started hurting really bad. The pain got worse after he lifted a panel 6 months ago. As evening came, the men left the construction site, and that's when one of the seniors, Stephen, approached them and asked why Tony was handling all the work. He was talking to John, who was really upset that his partner Tony was doing all the work for him. Then John asked the boss why he liked Tony so much. The boss said it's because Tony is the only one who tries to meet all the deadlines. That's why he likes him, while John doesn't listen to him at all. Then the boss went up to Tony and asked how his back was, and the guy said he was fine and thanked the man for his concern. Stephen asked if he was taking on too much responsibility, to which Tony hesitated a bit and said that, apparently, he did take on too much work. So then he asked him if he wanted to grab a drink with them, but the guy said he needed to head to the hospital because he was out of painkillers. That's when Stephen said goodbye and wished him a safe trip. Shortly after that, Tony hopped into a taxi and went off to take care of his business. As he rode in the car, he thought about his life. He was thinking that he couldn't work until he took his pills. He wished he could find a less stressful job where he could feel physically better. But even after sending out tons of applications, no company had hired him yet. After a while, Tony arrived at the hospital, still pondering why he was so unlucky. He wondered if it was because he only applied for administrative positions. He was afraid that his back couldn't handle heavy lifting anymore. Soon, a doctor named Hank saw him, and the moment he touched Tony's back, Tony yelped in pain and tears started streaming down his face. The guy said that the disc between the 4th and 5th vertebrae is worn out, and Tony can't lift heavy weights anymore. The dude didn't argue, just said that without a job he'd literally starve, but the doctor mentioned he'd told him this many times before. He asked if Tony really wanted to end up like his dad. That brought back horrible memories for the guy from 13 years ago, when during a shift change, his father died in an accident. That day, his dad was working up high and suddenly fell. The company blamed the contractor and its president just vanished. Thanks to the lawyers, they managed to get a compensation of 25 million won, and since then, their family has been just surviving. Stephen asked him what he'd do if his mom found out everything, and urged Tony to think again, since painkillers are just a temporary fix and his spine isn't going to last forever. The young man said that it's really hard to find a job that pays as well. The doctor said that if that's the case, he's got nothing more to add. Then he suddenly yelled at him, saying if he's going to keep this up, he might as well not come around anymore. He asked the nurse to take him out and said with that attitude, he won't see him in his office again. When Tony left the office, Hank grabbed his phone, opened his banking app, and transferred 2 million won to a woman named Hannah. Then he leaned back in his chair, sighed, and thought to himself about how Hannah's life went downhill after she met her husband. Soon, Tony arrived at another hospital where his mother, Hannah, was in one of the rooms. He sat by her bed, thinking to himself what a real idiot he was. Then he asked her if it hurt to go through all these procedures. Hannah said she was fine. She didn't want her son worrying, and then asked if it was him who recently sent her the money, adding that she's okay and doesn't need that much. When Tony asked what money she was talking about, she showed him the screen of her phone, which displayed an incoming transfer of 2,000,000 won. The guy didn't know what to say. He was clueless about who made the transfer, suspecting it could be the construction site boss, the foreman, or maybe Uncle Hank. So Hannah asked her son how things were going at the company, and the guy said it wasn't hard for him at all. He was actually doing pretty well, even though he only finished high school. The woman sighed, saying she felt really sorry that her son was having a tough time, and she couldn't even support him because of her illness. Then Tony suggested she should get some sleep, noticing she was really tired, to which Hannah replied that lately she did get tired very quickly, but now that her son was with her, she just couldn't go to sleep. Tony said he'd stay by her side and she could rest. Then he took her hand, and the woman agreed to take a nap. After a while, she found Tony asleep on the bench next to her bed. She then got up from her bed and covered him with her blanket. To herself, she thought about how silly her son was. He had the same smell as his father did when he was alive, a smell typical of someone who works in construction, so she couldn't help but notice what he had been up to all this time. She promised herself that she would definitely overcome her illness and help her son, who was currently trying to do everything on his own, for which she was immensely grateful. Soon a new day dawned, and Tony was back on the construction site. In one of the workrooms, some of the workers were already sitting. A gray-haired man, one of the supervisors, noticed two guys approaching the building. It was Tony and John. Tony greeted Kevin, his boss, who then asked what was up with John, wondering if he hadn't showered. The man said he'd had a bit too much to drink the night before. Kevin then told him to start working as soon as he cleaned himself up and mentioned that if they saw any workers from Elsung Group today, they should avoid them. Then he turned to Tony and asked him to bring a cup of coffee with 1 spoon of sugar. As they sat down at the table, he asked the guy how he was feeling. Tony replied that things were the same, but only getting worse. Then Kevin asked if he wanted to become a carpenter since they really needed more. He mentioned that in that case, instead of 11,000 won, he'd be making 15,000 won. Tony said he was okay with it, but worried his back might not hold up. Kevin praised him, saying he was dedicated to his work and really valued that quality in him. Tony was thinking that the money clearly wasn't from his boss. Then he thought about how tough work was for him, even though he knew his stuff, and it was causing him pain and discomfort. And now there's this mystery guy sending his mom money. So he decided to call Uncle Hank. He thanked him for the help, saying he figured out it was him who sent the money to his mom. He said he'd definitely repay him for his kindness. And then Stephen asked if he really hadn't left the construction site yet. When the doctor realized the guy was still working there, he yelled at him, telling him to finally listen to him and quit that job. After that, he hung up the phone, and right then, Tony's back was struck by pain again, upset that his uncle was always lecturing him. At that moment, a weird message popped up on his phone. He was shocked by what he saw. It was exactly what he'd been hoping for after 200 rejections. The message said that Elsung Company congratulated Tony on making it to the second round of interviews, and they were expecting him at the office in a few days. Right then, a weird blue screen popped up in front of the young man. When he looked up, he saw a strange message on the screen saying his wish had come true. The hero didn't know how to react to all this. He reached out to touch the screen, but his hand just passed through it. The guy couldn't understand why the screen wouldn't disappear and why he could see something like this. He started to think he was losing his mind. Suddenly, the system told him he was connected to the Elsung employee training course and asked if he wanted to start the training. At that moment, he approached one of the employees and asked for a favor. The man thought he just wanted to bum a cigarette. He pointed ahead and asked if he could see the sign floating above him. That's when the man suddenly yelled, asking if he was out of his mind or had just had a drink early in the morning. Tony quickly apologized to him and walked away. He realized why he ran inside the building. Nobody else could see this thing. He understood why that guy reacted the way he did. He'd be just as shocked if someone brought it up to him, because he truly was the only one who could see this nonsense. Then he went into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. In the reflection, the screen still didn't show, but it continued to hover over him. Tony pondered that this was total madness and guessed it was all just a dream. He wanted to join this company, but this bizarre training was something else. He'd seen stuff like this in TV shows, but it was still hard to accept what was happening to him. Yet being part of a big company was his dream. Then he decided he would go through the training no matter the cost. The system told him that if he quit halfway, he would lose all memories of this course. But Tony was determined. He said he was ready to take the risk, and then the system informed him that as a reward, he would get a job and gave him a skill called Prospective Employee's Gaze. When Tony stepped away from the mirror, everything before his eyes seemed to float. As he tried to recover, the system informed him that the skill to assess skills and work efficiency could reveal potential issues with prolonged use, causing a debuff called unsuitability. So Tony had to use this skill only when necessary. After a while, our hero headed to the bookstore, still puzzled about how such a skill could affect his surroundings. So he decided that with this ability, he might see something, and then he walked over to the bookstand. He closed his eyes, tuning in to use the skill, and soon decided to give it a try. He opened his eyes, mentally trying to activate the potential employee vision. However, the longer he looked at the books, the clearer it became that nothing special was happening. Soon the system reappeared before him, stating that this skill was only available in Elson Group buildings. Then he shouted out loud, complaining about how the system had way too many requirements. In the end, he bought a bunch of books at the store. But before he unpacked them, he went to a construction site to test his skill. When he opened them, he saw that in 2 out of 12 books, some paragraphs were glowing bright green. He returned the rest of the books to the store, but those with the markings he read all night long. Soon the interview day came, and Tony opened his closet to find the right outfit for the occasion. The system told him that a neat classic suit would be the best choice. Tony was nervous, but he knew that the main thing was to stay calm in this situation. Soon he stepped outside, and it was a nice sunny day. He sat at the bus stop and continued reading a book with notes in it. He kept reading it even while on the bus. Although the constant pop-up messages were annoying, on the other hand, he realized they weren't really helpful. Soon, one of the company's employees told him that the interview room was on the 2nd floor. But then Tony suddenly heard a man and a woman from the company quietly talking behind him. The woman told him that this guy scored 9861, which is an excellent score. The system notified him that he passed the appearance assessment. Tony sighed in resignation, noting that the interview info stated looks didn't matter. Elson Group gave candidates free rein but still scrutinized their every move. The company held a significant position in various fields including fashion, logistics, real estate, tourism, and more. Its scale was intimidating. Soon, Tony and the other candidates headed to the interview room, took their places, and prepared for a test. Many present were extremely nervous, unsure of how to answer the questions. There's a big difference between those who know the answers and those who don't. At least Tony had an edge there. Soon, men and women entered the room. A woman introduced herself as Kimberly, mentioning she joined the company in 2017 and would be evaluating skills today. The man was named Connor. He said he'd been with the company since 2014 and would assist candidates with testing. They knew some candidates had traveled from far and thus asked if anyone had any inconveniences on their way to the interview. Then one of the candidates raised her hand, wanting to ask something. She mentioned she traveled from afar and then added that in many companies, travel expenses are covered by the employer, so she wanted to know if their company pays for the travel. Tony thought to himself that no company would want a candidate with such an attitude. The next moment, the system notified them that the potential employee, the girl, had been excluded. Then he realized he needed to keep recording the results, but he wondered if he had to solve all 200 questions or if it was okay to make a few mistakes. With only 30 minutes for 200 questions, Tony soon found out he had just 1 minute left. He decided he didn't have to complete the test fully, unsure who gave him this ability, but figured it would be a sin not to use it, to do everything within his power. After finishing the test, he headed to a local spot to meet up with his construction buddies, and that's when Steven asked him why he didn't show up for work yesterday. Since Tony never missed a day of work before, Steven guessed he might have got himself a girlfriend and suggested he take her somewhere nice. Tony apologized and thought to himself that if he mentioned going to an interview at a big company, they'd think he's a rat. Stephen laughed, saying he's just a young guy, and then added that he now understands where all his money goes. Tony didn't think about how close he'd gotten with the foreman and the others, and if it weren't for his back, he'd have kept working there. At that moment, the blue screen popped up again, the system advising him to be ready for the interview results. The system mentioned there was a special feature related to the interview. The overall task required him to prepare for the final interview where he'd have to answer questions from the director. Tony got a bit pissed off. He couldn't believe the system was asking him to meet with the director himself, but the penalty for not showing up was being transferred to another construction site. Stephen was distracted from his dinner by the sound of his cell phone. It turned out it was his boss, Kevin, calling. He asked him to set up a meeting for him and Tony. Stephen said he'd send the guy over right now. Then he turned to Tony, saying the boss wanted to have a word with him. He smiled, asking what was up, since Tony didn't seem surprised at all. Tony sighed, saying that the boss pays him, so there's no sense in avoiding him. Then he left the place, realizing he needed to go meet and talk to the boss. Soon, Tony arrived at the construction site. The tension between him and Kevin was pretty thick. Then the guy said he'd tried his hardest, so Tony would be working as a carpenter with the head foreman tomorrow. The hero asked him why he made such a sudden decision. That's when Kevin yelled, asking where else he could find someone like Tony, questioning what he would do without a carpenter, and then the hero said he was cool with it. Kevin said he could find someone to paint the walls, but finding a carpenter wasn't that easy. He couldn't afford to lose someone like Tony. The hero was really annoyed that his boss had been yelling at him for so long, making it impossible to talk. At that moment, the system notified him that he had unlocked a side quest. He needed to listen to his boss's story to the end because the boss thought he was a good guy. The hero wasn't thrilled about this task, but he didn't have much choice. He turned to Kevin, asking him to keep it down a bit, saying he'd listen to him and then he'd have something to tell the boss himself. So Kevin said that now, without a second carpenter, he can't meet the construction schedule. Because of that, he's losing millions of won every day. Then he yelled again, saying that Tony just couldn't leave. The hero thought it over, he was just guessing, but in his opinion, it was totally his fault. He decided he had to step back. Then Kevin asked him to help out for at least a week. Tony wasn't too keen on agreeing, but decided he'd help him, but just for a week. Kevin was immediately thrilled and thanked him, saying he tries to take care of him. He thanked the guy for coming to him. Then he said it was the only time he'd ever ask him for something like this. He pulled out his phone and called the president, saying everything was settled, and he could meet the plan in a week. They'd finish the construction in 7 days. Evening came around, and the workers asked their boss how things went. He told them everything was great. Soon, 2 men approached Tony. One was his boss, Stephen, and beside him stood a man Tony didn't recognize. Stephen asked him to come down and said to greet the director of Elsung Group. Tony didn't come down from the ladder and shook the man's hand, saying it was their first meeting. The director introduced himself as Charlie. He started to worry when he heard that the construction plan was at risk, and thanked Tony again for his help. Even though our hero smiled and said he was happy to help, he thought to himself that he was only here for a week since his back was already giving out. Then Charlie said that he would be heading to the office the day after tomorrow, and since it was his last time here, he suggested they have a drink. However, Tony looked away awkwardly and said he couldn't go because he had a meeting scheduled for tomorrow. After work, he went back to the hospital to visit his Uncle Hank. As soon as he entered the office, everyone else in the hospital heard a terrifying scream. The doctor tried to fix Tony's back, but the situation was so bad that any touch caused him incredible pain. Then he suggested Tony should head up to the 2nd floor for some physiotherapy. The pain brought tears to Tony's eyes, and he was really worried about an upcoming interview, while the doctor kept scolding him for not taking care of his health. The next day, Tony still made it to the Elsung Group for his interview. Along with 2 other candidates, he stood before the directors and introduced himself, saying his name was Tony. When he looked up, he saw a familiar face. It was Charlie, the very director of the company he had met the night before. Charlie smirked, saying they had already met, so Tony could take a seat. Once all the candidates were seated, the directors decided to start the interview. Charlie expressed a desire to start first, and the others supported him. Then he turned to one of the candidates and asked him to stand up. He noticed how the man was dressed, white socks with black trousers, and asked him what he thought about his outfit. The candidate replied that it seemed like the clothes didn't really match. Tony was thinking about how the system had warned him that there would be increased pressure at this stage. Then Charlie asked him why he still wore that outfit if he himself thought it looked off. Tony realized that the room was filled with an atmosphere that was causing the candidates a great deal of discomfort. This kind of atmosphere brings out all their hidden traits. The candidate couldn't answer Charlie's question. Then the man asked him why he was silent, wondering if he couldn't control his emotions. Tony knew that the first thing to do in such a situation was to calm down. This interview was testing their composure and ability to control emotions, so it was essential to keep cool. Seeing the confusion on the candidate's face, Charlie sighed in dissatisfaction. The man was too stressed out. He couldn't even muster a word. He couldn't handle the situation, and once everyone realized that, Charlie asked him to take a seat and started interviewing the next candidate. Soon it became clear that the girl had no experience in social work, and although she tried to justify it by saying she had been studying all this time, Charlie told her that wasn't what their company needed. When he asked her how she planned to work with clients, tears welled up in her eyes, and she didn't know what to say. Her interview soon ended too, and she left the room in tears. Tony realized that Director Charlie had asked the first question to throw everyone off balance because the rest of the questions required mental preparation. Then it was Tony's turn. He stood up from his chair and introduced himself with pride. Our hero wasn't planning to leave here empty-handed. Then Charlie asked him what his education was. The hero replied that he was a specialist in banking, but Charlie knew he hadn't gone to university. Tony admitted that he indeed hadn't received higher education. Then Charlie asked him if he wanted to add anything else. The hero pondered that if he blurted out something wrong, he'd be crossed off the candidate list, so he decided to be honest. He knew he needed to pique their interest, so he said that he needed to make some money. Charlie said they were doing the same thing, and he joined for the same reason, but he asked why he chose a job over university studies. Tony said he didn't regret his decision at all. Instead of studying, he went to work on construction sites, spending all his free time in the evenings on self-education. He said he never neglected it. Maybe he didn't go to college like everyone else, but through online courses, he got qualified as a technical specialist. He tried to compensate for the lack of university in every way possible, and as a result, he managed to get an education in economics. Charlie was really surprised by that response. He turned to look at his colleagues and smiled, saying it was wonderful. That way, his part of the interview was done, and he handed it over to his colleagues. The man asked the hero what he could do for their company. Tony knew it was a tough question for the average person, but he was ready for it. The reason he wants to work here is that the job isn't too stressful and the pay is decent. So he could cover his mom's medical bills and not worry about what he's going to eat or his own health. He'd be free. Then he said as long as it doesn't break any laws or social norms, he's down for anything. Then the man asked him why he set such terms. Tony said otherwise, the image and future of the company giving him orders would be destroyed. He supports the company's integrity and its contributions to the country's development. Only under these conditions will Elson Group move in the right direction according to its goals. The hero knew it wasn't the perfect answer. He just had to convince them that there's no such thing as a perfect answer, because the interview is all about seeing how people handle stress. Then the guy decided to throw another question at him, asking if he had a girlfriend. Tony said he didn't have a girlfriend, just so happened that there weren't many women around him. He mentioned that if there was someone suitable around, he'd be happy to meet her, which made Charlie laugh. Then he told Tony that he did great in the interview. He said the interview was over and all the candidates could leave. Evening came soon after, and Tony headed back to the construction site. Stephen walked up to him, surprised to see him there. He waved at him and mentioned that he had a lot on his plate at the dispatch office today. He noticed Tony looked a bit off, so he asked him what was up. The hero wanted to tell him what was really going on, but just then a weird noise interrupted their conversation. Turned out it was John coming over, but he tripped over a beam and fell. The hero thought about how John had gotten into trouble again, but he had too much work to really worry about that. Then Stephen said they were all having dinner together tonight and invited Tony to join them. But the hero said he wanted to talk to the boss. Stephen, like everyone else, was curious about what Tony wanted to say. That's when the guy announced he was finishing his last week here, which really surprised the men. At that moment, the system sent him a new task. He needed to attend the evening and listen to stories, with no reward or penalty for refusing, which was quite unusual for system orders. Then Tony asked the boss what was for dinner, and Steven smirked, saying they were having soup tonight. Then Tony said if the boss fed him beef, he'd switch sides to the manager. John and his buddy were really happy that Tony made that decision, and they wanted to try some meat themselves. Steven tried to look displeased, saying he'd only agree because everyone was asking. Soon, the guys arrived at the place and decided to drink to such a great day. Steven said that this week had been really tough. Lately, fewer people want to go into engineering. His brother's a gas fitter, and he himself has worked in his field for 20 years. He didn't see the point in studying when it's so hard to earn well, so he decided not to pursue further education, thinking it was pointless. John said it's not for nothing. The boss says that because he's already too old. At that moment, Tony pondered that even when drunk, he doesn't spout nonsense, but it's really hard for the technical staff. Nowadays, industry is driven by science, technology, and pharmaceuticals. When everyone was so drunk they couldn't think straight, the hero turned to the window and started watching the night city. A whole week had passed since that evening. Tony was hanging out with Elsung Group when suddenly his boss called and asked why he hadn't shown up for work. Then Tony said that he had mentioned yesterday he would take a day off because he needed some rest. However, Steven insisted, asking Tony to come to work since he hadn't slept all night and didn't want to work alone. But Tony said he couldn't make it and wouldn't come tomorrow either, and before his boss could respond, he hung up. At that moment, one of the company's employees approached him and said she would take him to the debate venue. She explained that the second interview was a discussion among 10 people, and Tony could join in according to the speaker's words. The topic of the group discussion is OECD countries, with South Korea being part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Today, they'll discuss the issue of high education costs and ways to solve this problem. When all the candidates arrived in the room, the moderator announced that they should raise their hand, state their number and name, and only then speak. That's when Tony realized this was exactly what he'd been worried about, because you really need a lot of experience in social work for this topic. He mentally thanked the group leader for the invaluable experience. Soon, the man leading the debates made some notes on his tablet and announced that they needed to start. Tony confidently lifted his head, gearing up for the group interview. He was assigned number 2. The discussion kicked off soon after, and number 3 chimed in, raising his hand and saying that he believes the economic situation over the past few years has had a serious impact on the country. As a result, the cost of education has skyrocketed, and to break into the top 10 economically strongest nations, they shouldn't skimp on human resources. If education costs were lowered, they could support more talented individuals. Tony looked at him in surprise, wondering if this guy was a complete idiot. The topic had already been set on the reasons for the rising cost of education and ways to solve this issue, and this guy just repeated the question without giving any solution. He thought it was good that he decided not to answer first, as now he had time to think about his response. The conversation soon shifted to contestant number 7, who mentioned her parents spent 300 million won on her education, leading to lower birth rates since not every parent can afford that for multiple kids. And she believed we should encourage higher birth rates and increase family allowances. Number 3 agreed with her, pointing out that families are breaking up, birth rates are declining, education costs are skyrocketing, and boosting birth rates is a great solution. Tony thought about it and noted that it sounded good, but the company isn't to blame here since it's not a state-owned enterprise, so they don't need to worry about such issues. Then he raised his hand, suggesting they look at the situation from another angle. With that statement, he really surprised contestants number 3 and 7. Tony mentioned that their country ranks first in the world in education costs and second in the number of incoming students. Then he stood up, walked to the board, and said they should discuss the quality of education, asking everyone to look at the OECD education rankings, where their education system ranks 75th. From a young age, they have the choice to continue education after school or not, unlike in Germany where education is mandatory. They have the freedom to choose whether to go to college, university, or pursue self-education. As a result, the number of jobs perfectly matches the demand. And although the average salary there is higher than in Korea, the income disparity across different professions isn't as significant. However, in their country, there's a workforce imbalance, with insufficient support for fields like science, IT, and other technologies, particularly as most engineering positions are filled by foreign workers. Tony believed that if their education system became more structured, like in Germany, it would bear fruit, reducing the country's educational expenses and aiding its overall development. When he looked at the other debate participants, he saw doubt in their eyes, realizing they were puzzled by how he connected these facts. Then participant number 10 asked if he really believed that. It seemed to him that participant number 2 was dissatisfied with their country's education system. Tony was extremely surprised by such a statement from him. He didn't expect an open attack here, but understood that the main thing in such situations is not to panic. Then he apologized if he had offended anyone, stating that it was not his intention to slander their country. Participant number 10 said he really didn't like his words, that a foreign education system doesn't consider their country's traditions, and he thinks that adopting something similar is a huge mistake since they have plenty of outstanding and talented people. Everyone here was educated in Seoul or abroad, and they are here only because of their knowledge. Yet he couldn't understand why number 2 thought they were worse than the Germans. Then the debate moderator turned to participant number 10 and asked for his name. The guy replied that his name was Yen. Then the boss thanked him for participating and told him he was free to go. When he heard that, his face turned red, either from confusion or from anger. The boss said that, in his opinion, he wasn't a good fit for their company, but he thanked him for his hard work. Tony thought about how nowadays companies need talents who can gel with the team, and here's Yen, putting others down, thinking he's above everyone. Given the company's standards, he's the worst possible match. There's no point in hiring someone who wants to be the star at the expense of everyone else. After that, Yen left the room, slamming the door loudly behind him. Then the leader mentioned that they had a second topic about national pension reform. The debate participants discussed this topic extensively, and our guy pondered that this would never end. 25 minutes passed, and they still had opposing views that were unresolved. He just wanted all this to be over soon. Judging by the examiner's face, he was fed up with it all too. Then Tony decided to speak up, saying that at this rate they wouldn't reach a consensus, but by summarizing each presentation, 2 prevailing views could be identified. Participant number 1 said that the national and professional pensions should be integrated, like in Japan, while participant number 6 argued that the shortcomings of the national pension could be supplemented with private payments. Then he suggested listening to one more person and deciding by a vote. The examiner noted to himself that there was a heated discussion going on within the group, but this guy was quiet. Usually, people like him act as mediators in disputes, and such individuals are exactly what their company needs. Soon, he thanked all the participants for their work and announced that they were done for the day. After everyone had left, he made a note next to Tony's name, saying that this guy definitely handled it well. When our hero left the office, he heard someone yelling. A man was talking about being treated unfairly. When he turned around, he saw contestant number 10 arguing with the examiner, claiming he was kicked out unfairly. That's when our hero realized some people just won't admit their mistakes. When the hero blinked, he noticed the examiner seemed to be surrounded by a green aura. Tony couldn't figure out why his skill had activated. Now everyone looked totally different to him. He glanced around to check out the other people in the hallway. Behind him stood a man and a woman. The woman had an orange aura and the man a yellow one. Today's interview turned out to be informative. He learned something new. Firstly, if you blink 3 times in a row, it activates automatically. Secondly, each person has their own color, be it red, orange, or green. He guessed that the reds were people under 20, orange marked those who were 20, and greens were those over 30, but he doubted they were categorized by age. After a while, the hero returned to his job at the construction site. While he was busy working, a new message popped up on his phone. It said he passed the interview at Elson Group, and the final interview with the directors is scheduled for tomorrow at 3 in the afternoon at the company's main building. The hero was super excited about the news, happy that the day of the last interview was finally coming, but he knew he still needed to stay sharp. He decided he had to stay calm and absolutely had to nail this final interview to achieve his dream. After that, he approached John and decided to give him a tip, telling him he was loading too much paint on the roller, which would make it run out faster. But the guy didn't hear him and went ahead to load a ton of paint again, then aimed it upwards to start painting the walls. When Tony looked up, he saw a huge amount of paint flying straight towards his face. All that paint ended up on his head, and John immediately climbed down the ladder, apologizing to his partner. And although Tony was pretty annoyed, he said it wasn't worth sweating the small stuff. John kept apologizing, saying he was really sorry, but the hero calmed him down, saying he was all right. Then he headed towards the showers, and on the way, he ran into his boss, Steven. The guy asked him what happened, and the hero replied it was nothing serious, just work stuff, and said he was heading to the dorm to clean up. Steven mentioned that it's quite far, so he should rather use the bath on the first floor, which opens today. Tony had no doubts. He was sure about how the other workers reacted. But Steven told him that they all were informed to come and wash up after work today, so there would be no misunderstandings. Then the hero headed downstairs to wash off the paint, feeling really comfy with his hair all sticky. Soon he reached the right door. As he entered, he immediately stripped off all his dirty clothes and headed for the shower. After that, he took a hot shower, washing away all the paint. Then he moved to the middle of the room, where a man already was, and asked him what he was doing. Tony told him he was a construction worker. The man guessed that must be pretty tough work, seeing as he came in covered in paint from head to toe. Then the hero smiled and asked if this guy was the boss around here. When the guy told him he really was the boss, our hero was thrilled, saying the bathhouse was something else, a fantastic job, and then asked if he was paid well. The man said he was paid enough not to envy others, and then the hero thanked him again for his work. After that, the man suddenly dove underwater. Tony panicked, thinking the man had suddenly felt ill and drowned. He immediately jumped in to help, intending to pull him out of the water. At that moment, the man surfaced and laughed, asking if Tony really thought he had died. Then he said that he actually had a curse on him. He mentioned that in the bathhouse, he always had to press on, especially after a good sweat. Tony said that was very interesting, but thought to himself that it was the right move. You can't spot potential discomforts for clients without testing things on yourself. He said the man was a top-notch professional and looked very healthy, to which the acquaintance replied that he should also take care of his health, remembering to exercise and eat well while he's still young. Then he suddenly stood up, saying he had to go. Tony wished him luck and good health, hoping everything would turn out fine for him. The man smiled, said he hoped everything would be great for the guy too. When Tony left the sauna, a man in a suit followed him in. He headed straight into the sauna. Once inside, he called out to the president, who turned out to be that very man. He announced that the closing ceremony would be in 40 minutes and asked if he would attend. It turned out that President Christopher really was cursed after the construction. If he didn't take a bath here, an accident would inevitably occur within the year. The man hoped that this year everything would be all right. Soon, the day of the final interview arrived, and our hero tried to stay as calm and collected as possible. The system told him he just had to pass the final interview, but Tony wasn't happy, saying it wasn't that simple. When the system told him to just believe, he sighed in frustration, saying that if it wasn't going to help, he'd do it all by himself. He had to recall everything, starting from his past at the company up to today's events. Soon, he was welcomed into the company and greeted everyone present, thanking them for giving him a chance. Then the committee chairs asked Tony to take a seat. Our hero pondered over the system's advice not to worry, but figured luck alone wouldn't cut it at a meeting with the directors. That's when he decided it was time to use a skill. Looking at the directors, he noticed one radiating a blue aura and another a purple one. They all looked over 50, making him doubt if they really were the directors. Then, the only man among them stated that Tony had applied for a managerial position in banking and finance. The man turned to another director, mentioning that this guy hadn't studied at college or university. so he asked how he managed to get an education all by himself. The man said this guy must be pretty good to have come this far and asked his assistant for the results of past interviews. Soon, all the directors saw that Tony had the highest scores in the interview. They were extremely surprised that he did better than the graduates from the country's top universities. Then the assistant leaned over to one of the directors and mentioned he thinks this guy could be in the SSS group. This group usually includes relatives and descendants of the chairman's family, or mere mortals who have reached their level. Then the director turned to Tony, asking what kind of job he would like to do. Our hero said he'd prefer office work, but he'd be happy with whatever job they assigned to him. When the director said that Tony couldn't go, he was extremely surprised. Then the director said the interview was over and thanked the guy for his efforts. After he left, they started discussing whether he could be related to the chairman or someone from his inner circle, and decided to thoroughly check this information. One of the directors suggested that he was intentionally disguised as a regular economist so they wouldn't suspect anything. Another guy agreed, mentioning that it's exactly the chairman's style to start from the very bottom. It all seemed too suspicious, especially since the HR department noticed it first. They too can't afford to make mistakes. They speculated that a person from the SSS group had come to them. The story shifts to a fancy building. A young man entered his father's office who was extremely displeased that his son decided to show up after so long. He told him that he had failed, despite preparing for so long, and that such a disgrace had never occurred in their family before. The young man said he was very sorry and asked his father to give him another chance. When the man started yelling at him, saying that he didn't show up for the interview and had failed, the young man clenched his fists in anger. Then the man addressed his son by name, Tony, and told him to speak openly and hide nothing. The story moves back to the construction site, just another day at work for Tony. He got another message on his phone saying he'd been accepted for a position at Elson Group. The guy knew that nailing the interview with the directors wouldn't be easy, and he had this feeling that it was just a waste of time. Then another message popped up, telling him he needed to show up for a mandatory medical checkup at the county hospital. But he could also submit medical records from another hospital. Our hero wasn't sure what to do. He wanted this job because of his back issues, but now he was doubting if it would be a problem. So he decided to head over to Uncle Hank's hospital. As he walked into the office, the doctor asked if his back was acting up again. Tony scratched the back of his head and said everything was fine today. He mentioned that he'd just been through the final interview for a position at a big company. Hank was really happy for him, saying that now he wouldn't have to strain his back unnecessarily. However, he had a hunch that something wasn't quite right. Then Tony shyly lowered his head and said it was nothing. He knew he could only ask his uncle, but he just couldn't get the words out. He then said he wanted a prescription for painkillers, and Hank said he figured that's exactly why the guy came. When he looked at him, he realized Tony looked really sad, which surprised him since he usually seemed so confident. He couldn't figure out what the problem was. He remembered Tony mentioning that he had passed the final interview at a big company. That got the doctor thinking. If he was about to start a job, he'd need a medical checkup, and then it clicked what this guy wanted from him. He knew if he got caught, he could easily lose his license. But then Hank suddenly started typing on his computer, thinking how this guy was just like his dad, making everyone worry about him. Soon after, our hero went downstairs to get the prescription from the nurse. And then she handed him something else, too. Turns out it was a disc. Just then, from behind, Hank's voice reached the hero's ears, deciding to congratulate him once again. He mentioned that the guy would pay for his meds as soon as he got his first paycheck. Tony smiled, realizing just how much his uncle had helped him. Soon, the hero headed back home. He received another message from the company, stating that he had passed the general staff selection at Elson Group. The hero knew he had survived only because of his uncle's help, and that made him feel really good. At that moment, the system window popped up above his head again, announcing that the employee store was available to Tony, and his current balance was 5 points. The system explained that the store was a great tool to help solve work-related issues, and special items could be bought with points earned by completing tasks. When the window allowing him to open the employee store appeared, he immediately agreed. Soon, the system window expanded, featuring items for new employees like a sober-up pill that instantly removes alcohol from your system, vision lenses that let you see through walls within a 2-meter radius for 1 minute, a candy that fights off sleepiness for 6 hours and removes any signs of tiredness, and a charming scent that makes you more attractive, doubling the effect for the opposite sex. Tony couldn't believe his eyes. It all seemed like a game or some kind of magic. Then the system asked him if he wanted to lose his memory, and the hero quickly clarified that he didn't mean that. The system stated that it exists to help him succeed, and he was rejecting this. So Tony apologized for his misunderstanding and asked the system not to take it too seriously. The system then said it understood his words, but he should be more careful with how he phrases things in the future, which really pissed Tony off. Why did the system give him a quest to talk to his mom? Reassure her by telling her he got a job at a new company, with a reward of 6 points and unlocking a side quest, or else the side quest would remain locked as a penalty. The hero pondered that even without the system, he was planning to visit his mom soon anyway, which he did. He arrived at her hospital room and knocked on the door. When Hannah realized her son had come, she smiled. She told him she was feeling better, so he had nothing to worry about. So Tony decided to tell her that he got a job at Elsung Group, and Hannah was thrilled, saying it was great news. Then the guy said that in that case, she needs to get better so they can go home together. Then Hannah mentioned that today her aunt bought and brought her a whole box of apples, and she offered to take some for her son. Tony was happy to see that his mom was finally smiling. The woman said that her son had studied hard and landed a job at a good company, so she was very happy for him. Then Tony stood up and said he'd go ask the nurse for a wheelchair. He asked his mom to wait for him and headed down the corridor. When he stepped out of the room, the system informed him that the quest was complete. Then it told him that Hank was really worried about his mom, so Tony should call him and ask him to come to the hospital. He'd get 5 points and no punishment. When the hero saw the quest name, First Love, he was shocked. He couldn't understand what the system meant by that, since Hank was his father's best friend. His dad and Uncle Hank were best buds back in their youth. He was that friend who'd always show up and give his dad a lecture for not taking care of his health. Tony remembered those moments clearly from his childhood. Now our hero realized that all this time Hank had never been married. He still couldn't get over the fact that his dad's best friend was in love with his mom. So he asked the system if all this was really true, to which the system replied that it can't lie. Then our hero asked why it was giving him this task, and the system said it was for the success of a user named Tony. The hero couldn't figure out who was behind this whole system. However, the system replied that such information was not available to him. Looking around, clueless about what to do next since the task had a time limit, he had about half an hour left. He headed back to his mom's room and stopped by the door. When he entered, his mom asked where he had been for so long. Tony said he needed to make a call. Hannah told him if he was busy, he could leave. Her son replied that he was fine. Then he decided to ask his mother if she remembered Uncle Hank. Hannah was surprised when her son asked her that question, and Tony was also surprised by her reaction. Because of his mother's tone, he felt a bit weird, maybe because his dad had passed away. Then he got up and said he would make a call and then come back to her. The hero headed for the exit of the room, pulling out his phone as he walked. Then he dialed Uncle Hank's number. The doctor wasn't expecting the call. Then the hero decided to ask him straight up if he liked his mom. The doctor didn't know what to say, asking if something happened to Hannah. Without waiting for an answer, he immediately jumped up from his seat and asked which hospital they were at now. Tony replied that they were at Seoul General Hospital number 403, then hung up. Just then, the system reappeared beside him, saying that the hero had made a great choice. But Tony was really annoyed with how this weird thing was acting. He asked it again what exactly it was, but the system didn't answer again. 15 minutes after the call, Uncle Hank showed up at the hospital. He was running down the hallway, paying no mind to anyone, including Tony. He got here without even taking off his hospital gown. Finally, he met with Hannah. It was their first meeting since the hero's father died. Soon after, the system informed Tony that the quest was completed, rewarding him with 5 points. Once the hero calmed down and thought it through, He arrived at the conclusion he believed was the only right one. He stared at the system's window and wondered if all this could really be true. Then he asked her if his dad was really behind this system. The system was giving him one-sided help, sometimes even making threats, but it did everything to assist him. However, the system said it couldn't answer that question. The hero then guessed that it must be his dad behind it all, and that's why he wasn't answering directly. But the system didn't respond, so the hero decided he was still curious about what this entity was, and that he would gradually find out more about it. But now something else was bothering him. He was curious about what his mom and Uncle Hank were up to at that moment. When he peeked through the door's window, he saw them talking to each other. The hero couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw a smile on his mother's face. Uncle Hank was smiling too, and the hero had never seen such a genuine smile on his face before. The system once again told the hero that he made a good choice. Soon it was 10 o'clock in the evening, and by that time all visitors had to leave the hospital. Hank stepped out of the room and saw Tony behind the door. He figured the guy might have been eavesdropping on their conversation, but Tony said he had just walked up. Then the doctor approached him and apologized for his behavior. But the hero said there was nothing to apologize for. Hank mentioned that he was thankful for the help and for the call, and that it was time for him to go. Before leaving, Tony asked him once more if he liked his mom. Hank awkwardly looked away, saying he didn't know how to answer that question. Tony looked down, disappointed, expecting a clearer answer. He told his uncle that he would be at the training center for the next 3 days. His aunt sometimes visits his mom, but he wished his uncle would come by too. He paid for his mother's medical bills and got him a medical checkup at the company. And now the hero realized it was all not because of his dad's friendship, but because of his mom. He couldn't figure out his own feelings, so he told Hank to decide for himself. After all, they were the only ones who could look after Hannah. Hank said he got what the guy meant and that he'd think it over since it wasn't an easy decision. Tony spent the next 3 days at the training center. When he got back to the construction site, the boss told him they were moving to a new site tomorrow. He asked the workers to hit the sack early so they could start work as soon as possible. That's when Tony turned to him and said he needed to talk. Steven guessed he wanted another day off. He said the boss had to take off. The supervisor had a long weekend, so there was no one to work. Then our hero said he'd found a new job and had to leave. Steven yelled, asking how much he needed to pay him to drop the idea, wondering if $4 million a month would be enough. Then Tony apologized for what he had said earlier. He mentioned he had passed the final interview at Elsung Group. At first, Steven couldn't believe his ears. When he realized Tony was actually serious, his face twisted in shock. Then Tony said he couldn't make it to his shift tomorrow. Steven was totally surprised that he hadn't even gone to college, yet he managed to get a job at such a big company. The hero shyly looked away, not knowing what to say. That's when Steven told him he needed to work hard to not fall flat on his face. Tony kept his eyes down, saying he was really sorry. Just then, John and his partner walked up to them. John asked if it wasn't time for them to grab some food since Tony was leaving. Steven yelled at him because they were talking about this kid leaving, and all he could think about was food. So one of the workers said his wife called him, and he needed to head home. Steven was really unhappy that the guy wanted to leave early. But the worker said he's been disappearing at work all day and he wants some time at home too. He mentioned that even Tony decided to quit from here. There was an awkward silence between the men. Then Steven turned back to our hero. Tony figured he was about to get a lecture again. But Steven told him to come have dinner with them, saying it wasn't because he liked him, but because he felt awkward. Tony smiled, understanding that although his boss said that, he was staying true to himself till the end. When the men arrived at the restaurant, Steven said Tony wasn't going anywhere until he had a good meal, because working in the office isn't as easy as it seems at first glance. But the hero declared he was up for the job. Steven objected, saying that since he didn't go to college, it'd be easy for him, but others would mock him if they found out the whole truth. Then Tony looked up at him and said he understood all that, but he also knew that he had to do it. Steven said that if things didn't work out at this company, he could always come back to them. They'd always welcome him. There would always be a place for Tony here. The hero thanked his boss for such kind words. Then his partner coughed and pulled something out of his pocket, saying he would have prepared a better gift if he had known in advance. He then pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Tony. The guy was surprised, asking what it was. The man asked him to open the envelope and accept it without questions, like a real adult would, saying the amount inside would cover a few pairs of shoes. The hero immediately raised his hands, saying he couldn't accept such a large sum, and asked the man to take the envelope back. At that moment, John grabbed the envelope, saying if that was the case, he'd take the money. The man instantly yelled at him, telling him to give the envelope back to Tony. John was surprised by the sudden outburst and handed the money back to the guy. Tony smiled, saying he'd accept it after all. He was happy that despite his departure, the men were kind to him that day, as he saw his former colleagues for the last time. The very next day, he joined the Elsung Group company. The hero packed a large black suitcase and headed for the bus. He greeted the man overseeing the boarding and introduced himself. The man immediately checked his tablet to verify the details. He told Tony to get on the first bus, but suddenly he stopped the guy and asked if he was really born in '92. However, Tony replied that it wasn't his birth year. Turns out he was born in '94, and upon hearing this, the man told him to board the third bus, leave his luggage in the cargo hold, and head inside. Tony wondered if someone else here had the same name as him. As he got on the bus, he kept thinking about it. His name wasn't that common, so this was pretty surprising. Then he finally found his seat and sat down, sighing with relief. Then the bus supervisors announced that since everyone was seated, they were heading to the training center for new employees. Tony smiled, realizing he was now a new employee of the company. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone in his pocket. He got a message from Hank, asking him not to worry about Mom and to work hard. At that moment, one of the men who was sitting on the bus suddenly stood up in the middle of the aisle. He greeted everyone, introduced himself as Marvin, the deputy sales director at the Elsung Group branch in one of the cities, responsible for the third bus, and also thanked everyone for their work. Everyone on the bus thanked him back. Marvin said he would be their supervisor for the next 4 weeks at the training center, and asked if they had decided on their field of activity yet. Everyone on the bus started awkwardly glancing at each other, not sure what he was talking about. Then he admitted he phrased the question wrong and asked those who already knew which department they wanted to work in to raise their hand. Turns out no one raised their hand. Marvin said that training and retraining new employees is an important process at the company. They keep an eye on employees, evaluate their work, and offer positions based on training results, mentioning he joined the company right after such training. He was appointed to the sales department, where he is now doing a great job. So one of the employees asked, what if he ends up with a job he doesn't want? Marvin said that first off, they should keep their grades up because the top 10% of students will get to pick their own job. The other 90% will be assigned by the managers, but even with the first option, there's a chance you might not like the job you get. However, he mentioned there's a loophole. After working for a year, they could apply to change their field, though he didn't recommend it because the requests might just get rejected, and their old team might not take them back. When Tony heard this, he was really surprised. He realized that the company keeps a close eye on each employee. He wondered what it would look like to be the troublemaker if problems arose in the team. He didn't know what he'd do if his health went downhill and he urgently needed surgery. He feared he might have to quit his job, lose everything, and start all over. That's when our hero firmly decided that he had to hang in there till the end. Soon after, the buses arrived in the right city. For Tony, all this was new, and he felt a bit weird. But he also sensed a bright future ahead. After a while, the buses arrived at the company's training center. Marvin checked all the employees, making sure everyone got off the buses. He said that now all employees would receive their gear, with sports suits in the right sizes and personalized badges prepared for them. Soon, everyone reached the center where their luggage was checked and they were given the necessary clothing. One of the workers greeted Tony, told him he was assigned room B13 on the 3rd floor, and asked him to change and check out the gathering place. When our hero looked up, he noticed that the floors were labeled starting from the 2nd with letters A, B, C, and he was surprised to see that men and women were housed together. However, at that moment, One of the workers mentioned that men were placed from rooms 1 to 25, while women were from 26 to 50. Tony noted that they had smartly distributed the workers by gender. After a bit, he was already on his floor, needing to change before the gathering. Soon he found the room he was looking for. As he entered, he realized it had just one double bed. He sighed in relief, having expected to share the room with 3 others. Then he pulled out the clothes they had given him at the entrance. It was a pretty basic tracksuit, and he wondered why they'd chosen such a uniform for everyone. Just then, a young guy in a suit and glasses walked into the room. Tony turned around to see who it was. The guy smirked and commented that the room was pretty small. Tony disagreed and then introduced himself. The man awkwardly scratched his head and said his name was Archie. Tony thought to himself that Archie seemed like a decent guy, looking a bit older, which made him wonder if he should bow. He addressed him, noting that he seemed older, to which Archie replied he was 29. Tony smirked, saying he was 25 and hoped that wouldn't be a problem for them. He asked where he should sleep, suggesting he'd take the second floor. Archie said he'd stay on the first then, and thanked the guy for being considerate, since the second floor was a lot of hassle. Tony said it was no big deal, since they'd have to live together for a whole month. Then Archie was surprised that Tony got a job so early, being only 25, and was amazed that Tony had finished university in 3 years. At that point, our hero said he had a degree in finance and banking, so he indeed finished his education earlier than most. Right then, loudspeakers throughout the building came on, announcing that the interns were expected in the main hall in 10 minutes. The man mentioned they didn't have much time left. Archie smirked, saying he felt like they were in the army. Tony agreed with him, then suggested they head to the hall or they'd be late. After a while, our hero noted that the first day turned out pretty good. Seems like the bosses wanted to check on attendance. Over 260 people gathered in one hall to listen to his speech. The man on stage said that before they start training the new company employees, the director of training wants to have a word with them. At that moment, another man came onto the stage. The man greeted him on stage and bowed, then stepped aside to let him take his place. The man with glasses leaned into the microphone, flashed a big smile, and welcomed the interns. The interns greeted him back. Then the man commented on how quiet it was. He then yelled into the microphone, asking if this is really how the new company employees should be, and then loudly greeted them again. This time, the interns greeted him back just as loudly. The director mentioned that until last year, he was the CEO of Elson Group's main office. His name is Philip, and earlier this year, he was appointed to the Elson Group Training Center. He said their group is in the top 5 best companies in South Korea, but they started from the very bottom. The 60s were tough years. Philip went to Japan to hone his skills, and then he asked the interns if they knew where the first refrigerator in South Korea was made. One of the interns raised his hand and said it was made at Elsung Group Electronics. Philip said that was the right answer, and that it took them 4 years to develop and create the first refrigerator. They went through a lot of trial and error. Refrigerators were very expensive back then, but now everyone has one. Tony was thinking about how the director of the training center's speech revolved around the company's history. Specifically, he talked about its past and future. At that moment, Philip declared that from today, the interns are not just new employees. They are the future of Elson Group. From the moment they entered this training center and throughout their career growth, they will be Elson Group people. So he suggested that starting tomorrow, they should strive for the future of the company. Soon, the interns met again with Marvin, who said that lights out was at 10 p.m., and after 10, each intern would take turns being on duty on the floor. He said the interns need to pick a floor leader responsible for organizing their work, then asked those willing to take on the responsibility to raise their hands. Tony decided he should try for the role of the floor leader. Some other interns also raised their hands. Tony looked around and saw that aside from himself, a few others wanted to try out for the leader role too. When he turned his head the other way, he saw his roommate Archie had also raised his hand. Soon a decision was made, and after that, all the interns went back to their rooms, but Tony was a bit upset. It was his first day here, and he was already dying of boredom with no one to talk to, since his roommate became the floor leader and he was left all alone. Turned out, Marvin indeed chose Archie as the floor leader and thanked everyone else for their enthusiasm. He mentioned that the floor leader's term lasts 1 week, after which they'll discuss the pros and cons of his performance, and the role can be voluntarily resigned if someone feels overwhelmed. The interns said they understood everything, so Tony decided to step out of his room and pondered what he should do next. He looked around and saw the interns chatting with their colleagues. He thought maybe he should take a shower since there was no toilet, kitchen, or shower in the rooms. There was a communal laundry, a communal shower, a communal toilet, and so on. Cameras were installed in the hallways, so everything was under surveillance. Still, our hero decided that he should take a shower. He figured it was all minor stuff. Back when he worked on construction sites, conditions were much worse. Often there was nowhere to wash clothes, so they would just sleep in them on the floor. In dusty rooms, he ate noodles with beans, so this wasn't a big deal for him. When he found the shower, he realized there weren't as many people as he thought. Apparently, the rest felt awkward. Maybe they'd never been in such situations before. But one thing was for sure, there were plenty who weren't used to this kind of life and the necessity of sharing anything with others. The leaders secretly watched them and evaluated each intern. Soon after, Tony went back to his room and continued reading his books. He noticed it was already 8:30 in the evening. At that moment, Archie walked into the room. Tony didn't ask him if he had finished his duties, to which the man replied he still had things to do. Then he handed him some papers and asked him to fill them out. He said he was asked to distribute these forms to everyone, and then Tony said he'd definitely fill it out and then asked if Archie needed any help. The man waved it off, saying he was fine and that the kid should just go to bed. He still had things to do, but he'd manage on his own. Tony looked skeptically at his roommate but agreed with his decision. After a while, night fell. At 1 in the morning, Tony woke up to some weird noises. When he opened his eyes, he saw Archie standing in the middle of the room. He sat up in bed and asked if he was free now, to which Archie smiled and said he had more work than he thought, and then asked if he had filled out the form. Tony said he filled it out as soon as he got it, and Archie was really surprised by that response. The hero took a close look at his neighbor's face and noticed something odd. Archie seemed to move slower, and for some reason, it made Tony feel awkward. Just then, Marvin walked into their room and loudly called Archie over. He said he asked him to bring the forms by 10 in the evening and didn't understand what he was doing now in his room. Archie awkwardly looked away, saying that many were asleep now and he couldn't disturb them, so he would collect all the forms tomorrow morning. Marvin yelled at him, asking if he really decided to cause him trouble on the first day. Then Archie bowed and apologized, saying he would bring everything by 7 in the morning. Then Marvin sighed, saying he'd let it slide this time and insisted that he must come by in the morning. As he left the room, Tony wanted to ask his neighbor if everything was all right, but then thought better of it. He had already asked him twice, and both times Archie had said he was fine. He knew it would only take a few words, and maybe then they could get along. The next morning, Tony stepped out of his room when suddenly someone called out to him from behind. It was Marvin asking where Archie had gone, but our guy said he didn't know since he had just woken up. Marvin then asked him to find Archie, saying he'd be in the small conference room at 7:30, and if Tony sees him, he should bring Archie there. Then our guy asked for Marvin's number just in case. After that, our hero pondered how he and Archie hadn't even exchanged phone numbers. He hadn't imagined such a scenario. But he quickly realized there hadn't been time for that since Archie was really busy yesterday. His thoughts were interrupted by a shout from somewhere nearby. The guy immediately ran towards the noise to figure out what was happening. Turns out something was going down at room B19. One of the guys living there wasn't happy because Archie gave him a form at 6:30 and asked to have it done by 7, claiming it was impossible since he was busy with his morning routine. And since he volunteered to be the floor leader, he should be in control from the get-go. Archie bowed to him, saying he'd definitely improve, but he still needed that form filled out now. After that, he stepped aside, muttering to himself about how sorry he felt. The neighbor of the man who just yelled at Archie asked if he wasn't being too harsh on him. The man said there's no need to feel sorry for him because that's the fate of the floor leader, who can earn an extra 20 points by the end of training. He mentioned he read about it in the brochure, but really, that's the only way to snag those points. and if a leader can't handle it, they might be replaced. Then he added that it's not up to them to judge his performance, as the supervisors will handle that. Tony pondered how beneficial it is for the company to have new employees learn to communicate with each other right from the start. So there was this tension and negativity hanging in the air, and everyone was curious about what Archie thought of it. Suddenly, a system window popped up in front of him, notifying him of a new task. He had to read the company training center's brochure, learn all the information it contained, and be ready for anything. He also needed to lead the team as the head, which would help him make a good impression and earn some respect. The hero was totally surprised that the system asked him to do such a task. Then, out of nowhere, he saw Archie asking other interns to hand in their filled-out forms again. So he approached him and greeted him, and Archie asked what was up. Tony told him that the boss was looking for him, waiting in the small conference room on the second floor, and asked Archie to come there by 7:30. Archie cursed, realizing he only had 15 minutes left and he hadn't finished his tasks yet. Tony wanted to offer his help, but Archie had already dashed down the corridor, saying he'd handle it alone. Then he went back to knocking on other interns' doors, trying to collect their filled-out forms. Archie couldn't understand if he was doing all this just for some points, but he realized that if he were in their shoes, he probably wouldn't want to share them with others either, though maybe he just felt awkward accepting help from others. Still, there's a chance he's so blinded by his thirst for reputation that he forgets about human connections, and he couldn't do anything about it. He needed to stop helping others and focus on himself. Then he called Marvin and told him he found Archie and passed on his message. When Marvin realized they hadn't had breakfast yet, he invited him to the conference room and said they'd eat together since they were on the same team. After a while, Tony entered the room where Marvin was already sitting, waiting for Archie with the prepared statements, but he still hadn't shown up. The hero took an empty seat and started reading a brochure. To himself, he wondered why Archie took on a job he couldn't handle. He should have at least made a progress report. At that moment, the senior entered the room and apologized for being late. He said some had refused to participate, so he was delayed. Everyone filled out the form except for 11 people, and he attached a list of all who hadn't done so. Then Marvin yelled at him, asking why everyone agreed to participate except for them, and said that it was the group leader's problem. He also couldn't understand how he could make a team summary when 11 people hadn't filled out the form. He was extremely dissatisfied that Archie couldn't handle such a simple task. Archie shyly looked down, not knowing what to say in response. Then Marvin said it was getting late and he should go grab some food. Tony was surprised that Archie just left, abandoning the boss who was waiting for him without even starting to eat. He was quite disappointed by Archie's behavior. Turns out, Archie noticed Tony was also in the office, and that really pissed him off. So when he left, he slammed the door loudly behind him. After reading the brochure, Tony approached Marvin and asked if he had any more work to do because he needed to get some breakfast, to which the man replied that he still needed to check the B team's forms. The hero asked him if the other teams had filled out these forms, and Marvin said it was mandatory, a form for new employees. Then the hero said that since he had so much work, he could help him out, feeling sorry about what happened with his team. He mentioned that he had a big dinner last night, so he didn't need breakfast. Marvin agreed to accept the help, and then Tony said that the forms for teams A and C were different and asked which was the priority, to which Marvin said it didn't matter. The problem was that more than a dozen people hadn't filled out their forms, and it was messing up all the statistics. Marvin asked him to check out the team's survey wording while he planned to chase down those who hadn't submitted theirs yet. But just then, Tony stopped him. He said they had a list made by their senior, so there was no need to go room to room. It'd be easier to just call everyone and let them know they hadn't turned in their form yet. It'd be way simpler, and Marvin wouldn't have to stress out too much. Sometime after that, interns started showing up in the conference room office with their completed forms. They apologized for handing in their forms late, while Marvin watched everything with a slight smirk on his face. Eventually, they managed to wrap up the work quickly, all thanks to Tony's help. However, the hero denied making any significant contribution, claiming that the whole task was prolonged because of his team. But Marvin insisted, saying that the hero even had to skip his breakfast because of the work. Tony said it was all good, pulled out a protein bar from his pocket and offered one to Marvin too, saying this snack would give them both a boost. He mentioned it was a decent breakfast alternative, and he had plenty of these bars back in his room. Marvin accepted the bar and said that office work was really something. You've got those who dive right into it and others who find it pretty tough. Then they left the hall and headed up the stairs. Marvin mentioned that despite all the interviews and tests potential employees go through, this kind of situation happens every time, though maybe that's for the best. So they managed to weed out another guy. Then he smiled again and said he had to do some work in the morning, but he wasn't even hungry. So he and Tony decided to say goodbye. Before leaving, Marvin asked him to definitely bring more of those bars next time, or else he'd get a penalty point. After that, the boss said something else to the young intern. Sometime later, Marvin headed to a presentation where he was the lead, and interns gathered in the hall to hear what he had to say. He asked everyone to keep quiet because there was a lecture for Team B going on, so any latecomers should head back to their team. Then he checked with the group leader about the evening. He wanted to confirm the head count in case someone didn't show up, and Archie said everyone was present. Marvin looked at the guy skeptically and said that in that case, they should start. He suggested the interns familiarize themselves with the company's history and development. Just as Tony walked into the room, everyone immediately turned their attention to the late intern. The hero awkwardly scratched his head and apologized for being late. Archie was surprised to see that his roommate actually showed up at the conference. When Marvin saw the intern, he gave him a warm smile. Then he reached out his hand and asked him to come closer. As Tony approached, he turned back to the audience and said that before they proceed, he had something to say. He announced that from now on, Tony would take over as the group leader and asked if anyone had any objections. The hero himself was extremely surprised by this decision, but the system informed him that he had completed the task and received a reward, 5 points, and the shop's reputation was increased to 20. His task was to become the group leader, but he never thought it would turn out this way. He hadn't done anything, yet he still felt guilty. Archie was clearly unhappy with this decision, but they would have to live in the same room, so the hero didn't know what to do. The lecture ended. Marvin asked everyone to write down their thoughts about the lecture on a sheet and pass it to him, and the leader of Team B should collect all the sheets and bring them to the meeting room before lights out. Before the interns left the room, Tony asked them to hang back for a minute because he had something to say. He asked everyone to bring their notes to his room by 9:30 p.m., and also mentioned he'd set up a group chat that every intern needs to join, as all announcements would be made there. All the interns agreed, and then Tony suggested everyone go have lunch and take a break, except Archie, who wasn't too happy. Soon, our hero got to setting up that chat he talked about, noting that it was only for important messages, and advised the interns to use it only for urgent matters. At that moment, Marvin walked into the office where he was sitting and asked what he was doing there. Tony explained that the dining hall was too crowded, so he decided to have the chat here, asking if it might be better if the team started having lunch in shifts, to which Marvin said it was a good idea and worth thinking over. He also mentioned that there was a lecture for the interns in the afternoon, and the lecturer really hates it when phones ring during his session, so if they didn't want to lose points, Tony should tell his team to switch their phones to silent. Our hero said he'd definitely inform everyone and thanked him for the heads up. Marvin smiled, saying that he was really good at taking care of his team members, but he shouldn't forget that he's also still an intern. Then he said goodbye to the intern and went on his way. Tony smirked, thinking he could handle it since he's pretty good at this stuff. Soon he returned to his room and continued his work, noting to himself that being the class rep left him no time for anything else. At that moment, Archie entered the room, sat down at the table next to his roommate, and started giving him the stink eye. Then he suddenly asked if there was anything he wanted to tell him. But when he realized Tony was staying quiet, he forgot his question once again. The hero said that his appointment to this position was solely the leader's decision, and he had nothing to do with it. So Archie had no reason to be mad at him. Then Archie suddenly jumped up from his chair and yelled, claiming he knew that Tony had snitched on him to the boss that morning. However, Tony said that wasn't the case at all. The boss was actually waiting for Archie so they could work together and then have breakfast. But his neighbor didn't believe him, thinking there's no way the boss would have breakfast with just any intern. He wanted to continue his rant, but Tony stopped him, saying he was really not in the mood to talk about this right now. He said if Archie really wanted, he could take back the role, but they should only talk about it once he's calmed down. After that, the hero stepped out of his room, ignoring all his neighbors' complaints. Soon, he entered the meeting room where Marvin and the other leaders were already present. At that moment, someone knocked on the door, and Marvin let the person in. It turned out to be Archie, who said he wanted to change his room. He explained that under the current circumstances, he couldn't get along with his roommate. Then Marvin asked if his roommate was Tony. Archie confirmed that indeed Tony was his roommate, and he wanted to switch rooms or wanted Tony to do so. Marvin asked what the reason was, wondering if the whole problem was because he became the team leader. Archie then said he was disappointed in a traitor, adding that Tony came here only to suck up to the boss. At that moment, one of the leaders stood up from his desk and approached him, trying to calm him down. Marvin was surprised to hear him call Tony a traitor. Then Archie yelled out that stealing someone else's position was real betrayal. He had dreamed about this job and tried to prove himself as a leader, but Tony just hung around Marvin and snagged the role for himself. So the hero got up from his desk, walked over to his neighbor, and asked him to chill out and talk about the issue privately. He apologized to the managers and opened the door for Archie to come out with him, but his neighbor wasn't planning on leaving, saying he was currently speaking with the manager. Then Marvin stood up from his desk and asked Tony to stay, mentioning that Archie did indeed reach out to him. He smirked, saying that in that case they really should talk, but he himself had practically nothing to add. He suggested starting by telling Archie the reason he was replaced. Yesterday, Marvin had told everyone to collect surveys by 10 p.m. and bring them to him. And even though Archie didn't manage to get the work done by then, Marvin gave him until 7 a.m. to complete it. But Archie failed again. Then the boss gave him another 30 minutes, but even that didn't help. Archie tried to justify himself, saying that he did bring them in, but Marvin insisted, pointing out that there were those who didn't submit the surveys. And even if you consider that getting some people to cooperate isn't that easy, Archie could have at least compiled some basic statistics, but instead, he just brought in a list of those who didn't submit the surveys, and such a person can't lead a team. It was his first gig as class rep, but he couldn't even handle that. So Marvin couldn't let someone like him hold that position. At that moment, other leaders came up to him trying to calm him down since he had crossed the line, but Marvin said he wouldn't tolerate it, especially since Archie hadn't even thought about his mistakes and just blamed everything on Tony. Then he told him that while he calls his roommate a traitor, he's actually trying hard to cover for him. That day, when Tony shared a snack bar with Marvin, he asked to give Archie another chance. Marvin said he had been asking to give him a chance and supported him till the very end. He also recalled a moment at the conference when he asked Archie if everyone was present in the room, and he said there were no absentees. But Marvin knew well that Tony wasn't in the office at that time. Then he yelled at Archie again, saying if he had been honest, he would have stayed in the position. But he screwed up, and even if he fell to his knees begging for forgiveness, it wouldn't be enough. He said that Archie doesn't even realize what an amazing person he's living with in the same room. Archie and Tony were totally stunned, staring at their boss, not knowing what to say. Then Marvin walked up to Archie and asked if he still wanted to change his room. Since he came to ask for an extension, he'd listen to him. He told the intern that he had until tomorrow's lunch to pack up since he was leaving the training center and going home. After that, Archie and Tony left the office, and our hero turned to his buddy, saying this was exactly what he was talking about. He needs to learn to listen to others. The boss needs to calm down, so Archie should go apologize to him after dinner. He said that the boss is human too and just needs some time to cool off. Suddenly, Archie stopped and apologized to his neighbor. He took a deep breath and then thanked Tony. Tony said it was just advice from the team leader, and although there's an age difference, here they're all interns, so he wanted Archie to start treating him as a colleague from now on. When evening came, he gathered his team near the entrance of the training center, apologizing for calling them right after lunch. He asked them if anyone was familiar with Elsung group gymnastics. At that moment, there was a dead silence. Apparently, none of the interns had heard about this. Then Tony said that as soon as he read the company's brochure, he realized it was a big deal. Out of 1,000 points that interns could earn during the training, 50 could only be scored in one way, Teams A, B, and C competing against each other, and those who show the best results get the 50 points. He reminded them again that only the top interns get to choose their activities, so it would be wise for them to practice to help their team win. Luckily, Tony himself knew gymnastics and could make a video for them, so he asked his team to spend some time on this after dinner. As the team leader, he promised to do his best to ensure his team had everything they needed. He apologized once more for keeping the interns late and asked them to come by 9:30, also reminding them not to forget the messages they needed to prepare. After the interns left, they started discussing the meeting among themselves, feeling like they'd only score the 50 points if they were really lucky. But most agreed they had a great leader this time. When Tony heard this, he smiled warmly, silently thanking the guys for following him. However, he suddenly realized he was quite late, and so he rushed back inside the building. There was only one person left standing outside, and that was Archie. Even though he had apologized to his neighbor a few hours ago, he still looked pretty unhappy. Soon, our hero entered the office where Marvin was supposed to be, but he didn't see him inside. When he looked further into the office, he saw that Marvin was indeed there, squatting down with a colleague, examining something. Tony immediately realized it was a broadcasting amplifier, so he asked the guy if he could take a look at it. He also handed him some sheets that he was supposed to collect from his group. He mentioned that after the last session, when the former leader was late, the rest of the interns wrapped things up pretty quickly, but 2 people still hadn't turned in their forms. A few moments later, Tony said he had figured it all out, which really surprised the other guys since they had no clue what to do with that thing. Then Marvin decided to test it out loud and made a test announcement. He addressed the 2 who hadn't submitted their forms yet, asking them to bring them to the small conference room. After that, the interns who still hadn't submitted their forms immediately ran towards the required hall. As soon as they got there, they apologized for being late and handed in their forms. Tony thanked them for their cooperation and asked if they had heard the announcements, to which the guys responded affirmatively. Marvin's colleague Connor asked where he found this guy, to which Marvin smirked and said he spotted him for himself and wasn't planning on giving him away to anyone. Then the hero asked Marvin to allow him to make another announcement. He addressed the interns from his team, saying he expected everyone at the evening gymnastics in the training center hall. Soon evening came, and Tony headed to the designated place. Only 5 people showed up for the gymnastics. The hero expected more people would hear his message over the loudspeaker, but decided to settle with the number he had. Then the interns asked where he knew about Elson Group's gymnastics, to which the hero replied that long before coming here, he had worked on a construction site. That construction site was owned by this very company. Soon he decided to start with some gymnastics, saying he'd first show them how it's done, and then they'd all learn the moves together. First, they needed a good warm-up to avoid any injuries. Marvin watched all this closely. He noted that he liked Tony's approach. No rush, everything step by step. Marlin never thought he'd find someone so talented in this training center, so he decided to tell everyone about this guy. After that, he decided to continue watching the interns train. He secretly hoped that Tony would choose to go into sales after his training, as such a specialist would be worth their weight in gold. Late in the evening, Tony headed to the men's shower, completely drained after the grueling gymnastics session. He knew the main thing was not to be stingy with the senior points and to ask other interns for help more often. After his shower, he headed to his room, but he heard his roommate talking to his mom, who really wanted to visit him. Our hero decided not to interrupt Archie's conversation and just quietly left the room. Turns out, Archie complained to his mom about being removed as the head boy, and she was super pissed, even wanted to come down to the company and give everyone a piece of her mind. Tony stepped out of his room, sat down on the floor, and started dialing someone on his phone. Turns out, he decided to call his mom to check on how her treatment was going. Then he asked if Uncle Hank had visited her, and when he found out the guy was still in her room, he asked to speak to him and thank the doctor for looking after her. After everyone had their phone chats with their families, Tony went back to his room, lay down on his bed, and decided to check the chat group he created, realizing that everyone in it really appreciated the head boy and his work. He thanked all the interns for their kind words and told them they needed to keep working hard. After that, our hero crashed hard into sleep. But in the middle of the night, a strange glow woke him up. It turned out to be a notification from the system announcing that his official start date was June 1st, and Tony would start getting paid from tomorrow since he landed the job. Tony still couldn't believe he was actually the new employee. Then the system told him he had a new task: to improve his appearance to increase his edge. The hero was pretty nervous, but decided to take on the challenge anyway. The system gave him a skill to enhance his vision, which he could use 10 times. But Tony had no clue how to use this thing. The system instructed him to just think of the item's name and say "use" in his mind. Then suddenly, a bottle with purple liquid popped out of the system window. The hero was extremely surprised by what was happening, but he reached out and took the bottle. At that moment, Archie woke up because of the strange noises. He immediately got mad and yelled at Tony to let him sleep. After that, the hero went back to sleep, but 5 minutes before 6 in the morning, he got up from his bed and left the room. Outside the door, 2 interns who were on duty that night were waiting for him. He asked how the shift went, mentioning he heard it gets pretty chilly in the morning. Then he told the guys to open the windows and go rest, and that he'd take care of everything else. When it was his turn, he decided it was best to make sure there were no problems anywhere. That's when he decided to activate his skill, and at that moment, his eyes turned a shade of purple. In the morning, there was another conference where one of the leaders said that this Friday, the interns would find out their interim evaluations, which would affect their placements after the training center. Many factors influenced their scores, so he urged the guys to really put in the work. Tony decided that now was the perfect time to use his skill. He checked everything he could, and if you analyze the activity properly, the grades won't be a problem. Soon after, his team gathered on the field to practice gymnastics. The woman coaching the trainees was surprised why Team B was so good at gymnastics, especially the 6 people at the front. If this keeps up, the extra points will definitely go to them. She said she'd personally give the highest marks to these 6 because they worked tirelessly. Tony thanked his guys for their hard work, saying they did a great job. Soon after, our hero headed to the office to prepare for a test. He needs flawless grades to get into the department he wants. His teammates were extremely tired, but Tony kept studying non-stop. Soon after, trainees from Group B started coming into the office, wanting to practice with their senior too. On Friday, we hit the midterm tests, and Marvin said the interns had to showcase all their skills. The interns from Team B instantly knew the test would be a breeze for them. Tony also breezed through the test without any trouble. Soon enough, the test results were posted on a board, and the interns were a bit anxious. Turns out Tony topped the list. When he looked back, he saw Archie standing behind him, looking totally downbeat. So, our hero decided to check the list for Archie's name because the guy had been studying hard, and he couldn't believe Archie would score low. Turns out, he was almost at the bottom of the list, and Tony, knowing he had decent results before, couldn't understand how he ended up so low. But pretty quickly, he figured that Archie's score wasn't his problem. Just then, his group mates came over, proud that their leader clinched the top spot. The interns said they also made it to the top 10, all thanks to their great leader. But Tony told them it was all their own doing and they didn't need to thank him. Then he reminded one of the interns, Josh, that it was his turn to be on duty today, so he should get some good sleep now. As Tony walked down the hallway, he thought about how the test assignment prepared by the supervisor was pretty good. He expected to take the top spot just by using his skill, but he hadn't considered that the results would be publicly visible, which could be a problem for him. At that moment, a girl with short dark hair appeared behind Tony, trying to make sure it was really him standing there. She thought about how he looked a bit different when she was younger, but decided to figure that out later. As Tony headed to his room, the system appeared in front of him again. It told him something that really piqued his interest. When he entered the room, Archie was already there, looking extremely downcast. At first, Tony didn't pay much attention to it, but then he felt something odd in the atmosphere. So he turned to Archie, saying he was going to bed, and his roommate asked if he was pleased with himself. Tony didn't get what he was asking, so Archie repeated his question. The hero looked annoyed at his roommate, knowing he was about to start blaming him for his own troubles again. But it seemed like Archie truly believed that Tony was the reason for his failures. Then the hero sighed in frustration and said they had agreed not to fight anymore, so he would pretend he didn't hear anything. At that moment, Archie got up from his bed and made a show of apologizing to him. Then he asked bitterly if he should have apologized at all. He approached him and said that in that case, he would repeat his words more politely. He said that it wasn't enough for Tony to steal his position, he also had to snatch the top spot in the rankings. The hero countered, saying that his grades were at the bottom. Archie had the worst score on their team, and Tony and his place had nothing to do with it. Archie said this wouldn't have happened if he had stayed the class rep, and maybe he's at the bottom now because the bosses are unhappy with him. Then he suddenly yelled, claiming the boss is blind. He turned to Tony, not even asking what their relationship was. He assumed they were friends, or something like that, since he personally appointed him as the team leader. Then he suggested that Tony just gave him money. The hero was so shocked by his words that he asked him to stop spouting nonsense. When Archie tried to point at him again, they suddenly put out their hand and slapped Archie's. He asked how long he was going to slander him, then added that he had nothing to do with any personal relationships or bribes, and if he's being accused, he'd like to see some proof. Then Archie suddenly grabbed his hand, saying that Tony just hit him. He winced, pretending it hurt a lot, and started yelling across the room. Then he fell to the floor and started rolling around, talking about how much it hurt. Tony shut his eyes in frustration, saying he was patient, but even patience has its limits. Then Archie got up and double-checked with him, asking if he really just told him he crossed the line. He accused Tony again of hitting rock bottom. The hero tried to argue, saying he had nothing to do with it. That's when Archie yelled at him, calling him a complete freak, and now he might get kicked out because of him. Then he suddenly screamed, saying that he wasn't going to give up just like that. After that, he yelled again, claiming that Tony was beating him. Not wanting to hear any more nonsense, the hero left the building. He sat down on one of the benches and decided to listen to some music. But he was in such a bad mood that soon he took off his headphones and just sat there in silence. Just then, a strange woman in a business suit came up to him and asked if he really was that Tony. The guy looked at her and asked who she was. The woman grinned and told him he was being quite bold. But the hero still didn't get what she was getting at. So she asked him if he had bribed a guy named Marvin, asking if he was that desperate to become the class president. Realizing what she was hinting at, he immediately stood up from the bench and said he didn't know where she heard such nonsense, but he wasn't into that sort of thing. Then the woman claimed she suspected that Marvin had rigged a test result. Tony just walked past her indifferently, saying he knew what was up with this whole situation. He guessed that this woman was connected to Archie. That's when she threatened him, telling him to watch his words because she could get him kicked out of the training center. Tony said it was just a mid-level test for the employees, and the boss had no reason to tamper with the results since he's loyal to the company. Then the girl said that such actions could harm Elsung Group. Plus, they have circumstantial evidence, and it might just be a setup, but it could lead to serious consequences. She asked how she could possibly be favorable towards Tony in this situation. Then the guy turned to her and said he didn't know who she was, but he wished she'd stop attacking him. The girl said that he, of all people, should know what an attack looks like. Then Tony asked what the boss has to do with it, since if he understood her complaints correctly, he's not involved at all. Tampering with the results and beating up Archie are just his sick fantasies. All of it is complete nonsense with no evidence whatsoever. He was more than confident that there was no solid reason to accuse him of this lie. Then the girl yelled at him, saying she could easily make it so he's thrown out of the center without getting a word out. She said that Tony himself was to blame for getting involved in all this. Trying to stay honest, he ended up being very careless. And even if all this is just rumors, no one will believe him because everyone knows what Archie's parents are into. A guy with no money or experience shouldn't mess with someone who's loaded, so she has every right to blame Tony. The hero repeated, saying he has no issues with information leaks, and the interim assessment is just a measure of their abilities. They have no connection with manager Marvin. They first met at the training center, and as for the bribe, he's just broke, barely got his degree in banking. He asked if someone with such an education couldn't possibly score better, and if he's just studying hard and honing his skills, why would he need to bribe anyone? And if a woman talks about bribes and leaks so often, It seems only those involved in such things can survive in the company. In that case, he shouldn't stay here since everyone seems to enjoy slinging mud at each other. He said he'd give up his dream and then walked away, tired of this conversation. The girl shouted after him not to dare leave, then asked if he knew who she was. At that moment, a black car pulled up to the training center. A woman in a long orange dress came out and started yelling about how her son was beaten up and no one did anything. And right then, this stranger rushed over to her. She took the woman by the arm and asked her to think about her reputation. But the lady in the dress insisted on seeing the jerk who beat up her son. And she asked her subordinate to take care of her dear little boy. But the dark-haired woman insisted she stop yelling, since this is a training center. Tony immediately figured out what was going on. The dark-haired woman gave him a nasty look as he walked away. Tony stopped, thinking about what a messed-up family had just dropped into his lap. Meanwhile, Marvin was relaxing after an incredibly tough day at work. Just then, Tony walked by his office, stopped because he noticed the boss looked pretty miserable. Seeing a big suitcase next to his desk, he asked if he was going somewhere. Marvin said that there's a disciplinary committee meeting soon. Turns out Archie's dad is a member of parliament, so he has no choice but to head home. Tony figured it was all because Marvin gave him top marks on the test, but the boss said that had nothing to do with it. He said it was a fair evaluation of each team, and it just so happened that Tony scored the highest, landing him in first place. However, our hero noticed that the man's suitcase was quite large, leading him to only one conclusion. Marvin said it was like trying to put out a fire with straw. No matter how hard you try, nothing changes. Sometimes things don't go as they want. That bastard's father screwed everything up and there's no fixing it now. They'll either cut his salary or just move him to a smaller office. Then he suddenly burst into tears, talking about how now Tony and even Archie needed extra careful watching because of them. Marvin was upset about not doing well, and it hurt Tony to see him suffer. He said a company employee needs to be strong-spirited because they're innocent and nothing else matters. But Marvin said their innocence doesn't help them since their opponent is the son of a parliament member. Then he asked if Tony was up to something. The guy said he had a plan from the start. He just needed to muster the courage. Then he remembered the day when one of his team's interns, Josh, went to bed early to be up for the night shift. After that, our hero walked down the corridor, pondering over the test. As he approached his room, the system sent him a notification. Turning around, he saw the system asking him whether he could get others into trouble for their own good. For our hero, it was a tough choice, but the system said his decision would shape the future, so he better think it through. Later, Tony and Martha headed to a small conference room for a meeting held so late because of an information leak, suspicions of bribery, and even violence. Philip mentioned that this was the first time such a thing had happened since the training center was established. The lady with glasses stated that everything was as the director had described, calling these incidents a blatant case. She introduced herself as Anna, the general manager in charge of training new employees, and decided to make a statement. She requested the dismissal and disciplinary action against the Team B leader, Marvin. She also demanded that the new guy, Tony, who's still training, should be kicked out of the training center. Then Archie's mom jumped in, saying she hadn't mentioned that her son was bullied, which was actually the main point of their discussion. Next, she leaned towards Archie and caressed his cheek, saying that no one had the right to treat a child like that. She then turned to the directors, stating that bullying is serious, and if they don't make the right call, she would raise such a fuss that the whole country would hear about it. Philip said that as the director of the training center, he's responsible for the well-being of all interns, so he would listen to both sides, then review the evidence and announce his decision. He added that if anyone has issues with his judgment or objections to his decision, they should speak up right now. Archie and his reps stated that they had no objections. Marvin and Tony exchanged glances. Then they also stated that they had no objections. Philip then read Archie's statement, where he claimed that Team B's leader Marvin had given Tony the answers to the assessment test, and then he asked if there was any evidence to support this claim. Archie said all the staff at the training center are top-notch educated, but none of the Team B, including himself, got perfect scores, with only one person scoring high. Then he pointed out, without mentioning that he didn't even go to college, so there was no way he could ace this test. That's when Philip called Archie's statement an indirect proof based on assumptions. Archie was pretty upset with that response. Then Philip said they need to look into the second issue, where Archie accused Team B's leader, Marvin, and intern Tony of unfair grading because of their relationship, and that's also why Archie was stripped of his team leader role. The leader said he also thinks these are just circumstantial evidences. Archie had no choice but to agree with that. The leader was tired, sighed, realizing there was nothing substantial here either. However, even if these accusations are indirect, they raise valid doubts, and then he asked if Marvin had any rebuttal, because otherwise, he'd have no choice but to accept Archie's claims. Then he turned to his colleague, and the guy totally agreed with him. Philip said they had heard Archie's statement, and now he wanted to hear Marvin's side, asking if he had any evidence to refute it. But Marvin stood up and declared that he had nothing to say, no evidence to contradict. Philip sighed and continued to review the statement. Then the boss asked Tony if he had any evidence to the contrary. Surprisingly to everyone there, our hero said he had nothing. Philip asked if he really had to accept Archie's statement. Then Tony stood up, saying that outside there was someone who could prove his innocence. He hoped the boss would let this person in. Archie, his mom, and Anne were extremely surprised that there was a witness. Tony remembered the evening when Archie's mom first came to the training center. As they walked past him, the system appeared before him again. It claimed that Tony wouldn't be able to escape the crisis, but he wasn't alone in this world. He had a close colleague. The system explained that in human relationships, it's normal to give and take, but such relationships are based on trust. You need to reach out first, and the more trust there is, the more generous the rewards. So it asked Tony to seek help from others, and if they were his true friends, they would assist him. That's when our hero decided to message his team, hoping to find someone who could help him, but soon realized he didn't have many people ready to stand up for him. Some folks were ready to help their senior, and Tony sincerely thanked them. After that, he moved forward down the corridor. At that moment, he saw Marvin sitting in the office next to his suitcase. So, now in the discussion room, he asked again if his witness could come in to say a few words. Philip had no objections and allowed the person to enter. Right then, the door swung open and the guy who walked in greeted everyone there. He introduced himself as Josh from Team B. He claimed he had evidence that Tony didn't know the test results beforehand, starting with, they'd need Team B's assessment test and the optical mark recognition cards. That's when Philip asked Connor to bring those cards over. Soon, the test sheets and cards of 5 people who studied with the team leader were laid out on the table. Then Philip asked Josh to show where the evidence was. Josh explained that every evening, all 5 of them studied together with their leader, Tony, but unfortunately, except for the leader, all 5 got the same question wrong. Then Philip asked, doesn't that make him worry even more about a possible leak? Josh pointed out that if all 5 of them made the same mistake, it means their suspicions were valid, but they got different questions wrong. Connor then said that if that's the case, it might seem like they intentionally made mistakes on different questions. So Josh suggested the managers take a look at some other documents, which were a list of people who answered 3 or fewer questions incorrectly on the assessment test. To prove their innocence, they got all the signatures. Then Philip said he would check it out. He asked if there really were that many with only 3 mistakes or less. Josh said that's exactly right. He believes the issue isn't with information leaks, but with the test being too easy. The Team B leader is less educated than everyone here, that's true, but despite the tough hiring process of the company, he made it here thanks to his talent. Even when they were studying in the evenings, he worked harder than the rest, and given the low difficulty of the test, Josh didn't think a high score was an impossible task. Philip had no choice but to agree with him. In that case, it turned out that the Team B leader scored the maximum points on his own. Philip said it was pretty obvious. Tony is a perfect leader and a great intern. He gives it his all every day. He's always actively involved in the life of the whole team, and it was his idea to prepare the material and shoot a video about gymnastics, which earned their team quite a few extra points. Josh knew that his words were just a subjective assessment based on his opinion, but he suggested to the leaders to think about it themselves. Doesn't a guy like Tony deserve the highest score? He said that the senior is talented and smart, which is a good reason to suspect him of having special relations with the team leader. At that moment, the system informed Tony that he was no longer under suspicion. The other interns, who volunteered to help their senior, were eagerly waiting outside the door, trying to overhear what was happening inside. At that moment, Josh came out of the office. As soon as the door closed behind him, he immediately loosened his tie, saying he thought he was going to die of nervousness. Meanwhile, Philip said that after Archie's circumstantial evidence, Josh's words seemed more credible to him, and Connor agreed. The director said they would accept the response from the team leader Marvin and intern Tony regarding the bribery and information leak issue. He stated that Marvin and Tony are declared innocent. Just like he said at the start, he won't accept any objections to his decision. Then Archie's mom slammed her hand on the table with force. She asked if they really think her son lied to her. She stated she wasn't about to give up and could admit that this foolish guy might have outperformed her son and got the highest score. However, she wanted to clear up the issue about him hitting Archie. Marvin realized he was starting to boil over. Suddenly, he stood up from the table and said that this mom was way out of line. Tony tried to calm him down, but Marvin said he had something worth fighting for. He asked Tony if he really did hit Archie, to which our guy responded that it never happened. Yet he again asked the boss to sit down and cool off. Marvin had no choice but to comply and sit back down at his desk. Seeing this, Archie and his mom smirked with satisfaction. That's when Tony decided to talk to the director, Philip. He said he had a refutation regarding the violence. He remembered that day when the system offered him a choice. It told him to turn on the voice recording feature on his phone and keep it active for an hour. After that, he entered the room where Archie was sitting. Turns out, he recorded their entire argument on a voice recorder. He brought this recording to the discussion hall. It clearly captured Archie making up the story about being beaten up. Everyone heard him screaming that Tony was beating him up, but there was no beating at all. Marvin couldn't believe his ears. When Archie realized the mess he'd gotten into, he clenched his teeth in anger. Anna and Archie's mom didn't know how to react to that recording. The principal and his colleague looked extremely worried. Tony said the recording went on for 10 minutes. Archie's mom gave him a disapproving look as he didn't know how to act. Then Tony mentioned that Archie's dad is in Parliament and it would be really bad if this recording went public. He then said that if Archie admitted his wrongdoing and left the training center, he would delete all the files. He said Archie had made up 3 false accusations against him, but still, he wanted to give him a chance to admit his mistakes. Tony made it clear he wasn't going to entertain any absurd requests or accusations, thanking everyone for listening to him. Philip said if he had decided on that punishment, then he was okay with it. Archie's mom immediately stood up from her chair and started smacking him on the back of his head. Anna watched everything in confusion, realizing she had lost. When it was all over, Archie and his mother drove away in their car. Just then, someone from the training center came out and called out to Anna. As the girl turned around, she saw Marvin with a sly smirk on his face, asking her what that was all about, saying he'd never imagined she could grovel like that. He asked why the principal had decided to turn a blind eye to it. He guessed that Archie's mom must have promised her a house or a car. Then Anna said it was all too complicated and he wouldn't understand. But Marvin kept mocking her, saying it must be tough losing to nobodies like them. Anna asked if he was trying to slander her. Then Marvin smirked and pulled out his phone, starting a recording. It was made the day Anna met Tony in the courtyard of the training center. She immediately demanded he turn off the recording. Marvin asked if she was ready to talk now. Then Anna asked what he wanted. Marvin said she needed to fulfill Tony's request and disappear from here. She had to come up with a reason for her decision to leave. Anna demanded he give her all the recordings, and only then would she leave. Marvin said he wasn't as skilled in scheming as she was, so he needed assurance. He told her to call HR herself, or he would do it, and only then he'd delete the recording. Anna cursed at him. She didn't expect him to pull something like this. Then the man said that in that case, he had no choice but to report it to the management. But suddenly the girl stopped him. She pulled out her phone from her pocket and dialed a number. She called her boss, apologizing for disturbing him so late. She apologized and said she was very sorry, but she had to leave her job. After that, Marvin smirked and deleted all the recordings from his phone. Anna apologized to the director again and said her reasons for resigning were personal. The next morning, Tony could barely open his eyes. All these disputes totally drained him. But after a while, he gathered all his strength and headed to the first floor. The bus boarding was supposed to be happening now, and he was in charge of his group. He went to the courtyard, mentioning that there were only 15 minutes left before the tour at Elsung Group plant, and the trip would take 1 hour and 40 minutes, so he asked everyone to hit the bathroom beforehand. He said that Team B should head to the third bus. At that moment, a girl with a short haircut approached him. She extended her hand, asking if he really was Tony, the Team B leader. His cheeks turned red, and he admitted that yes, it was him. The girl asked why he wouldn't shake her hand, and then Tony hurriedly wiped his palms on his suit, saying his hands were dirty and he wanted to clean them first. After that, he timidly shook her hand, asking who she was since it was the first time he had seen her, to which the girl replied that her name was Samantha. She said she's heading Team C starting this week. Then Tony asked her what happened to the guy who had the job before her. Samantha said they used to switch every week and was surprised that things were different in Team B. But Tony said that wasn't exactly the case. Then, out of the blue, she laughed sweetly. She asked how long he was planning to hold her hand. Tony laughed awkwardly and let go of her hand, saying he'd remember her name is Samantha. She was surprised he didn't remember her and wondered to herself if this was really the same Tony. Our hero mentioned that she ranked second in the midterm test, which was impressive. Then Samantha asked if he was stumbling over his words on purpose. Tony scratched the back of his head awkwardly, saying he was a bit nervous and couldn't string 2 words together. But Samantha apologized, saying she was too pushy, and added that if Tony, like her, decides to apply for the strategic planning department, they'd see each other quite often. So she wanted to get to know him beforehand. The hero was surprised to hear about the strategic planning department. At that moment, the system informed him that this department is the brain of the company, determining its future and key aspects. Hence, it's considered crucial, with potential profits being virtually limitless. Tony was extremely surprised that you could earn practically infinite income in this department. When Samantha noticed he was looking somewhere behind her, she turned around, thinking someone was standing there. Then she turned back to him, saying that they have the weekend off, so they could have dinner in the city near the training center. She asked if it wouldn't be too much trouble for Tony. She mentioned she had ideas for collaborating on a strategy for their studies at the training center, as you need to be in the top 5 in grades to get into the strategic planning department. She asked him to think about it and hoped he could spare her some time. Then she handed him a piece of paper with her phone number on it. She said that for those aiming for the top department, there's nothing wrong with sharing information, and Tony thanked her for that. Then she mentioned it was time to board, so she needed to take care of her team. Tony awkwardly said that he also needed to get going. As the girl walked away, he kept watching her. Samantha turned around and said that it doesn't matter what their colleagues are doing right now because their alliance comes first. Tony smiled at her and pressed the piece of paper with her phone number against his chest. At that moment, a man peeked out from behind the neighboring bus, watching Tony and Samantha's conversation. As he watched the girls, his cheeks turned red. When Tony got back to his room, he started to wonder if Samantha's intentions weren't all that pure. Still, he couldn't figure out why she decided to connect with him. He was really worried about the whole situation. Meanwhile, Samantha headed to the board where the test results were posted. She noticed something odd. Tony's name was both at the top and the bottom of the list. She couldn't figure out why someone with the same name had different scores. The only info she had was that Tony, the grandson of the Elsung Group's chairman, was at the training center. However, she realized she didn't have enough information and needed to look into this situation more closely. Nevertheless, she decided she had learned enough and wondered if the company had really put the chairman's grandson at the bottom of the list. That evening, Tony didn't put on his casual clothes and went to room B20. He opened the door himself, asking what he needed, since he had already said it was his day off and he wasn't planning to go anywhere. Yet Tony still went out, and once outside, Josh asked him if he was inviting him to dinner. But the hero kept quiet, which really made Josh suspicious. Meanwhile, Tony was pondering what Samantha's real goal actually was. The girl herself said that she was too persistent, having decided to meet in advance. Tony understood that he should aim for the strategic planning department, but he couldn't grasp if Samantha chose him as a partner just because they both ranked at the top. He remembered her words about their alliance being above everything else. The hero decided it was too early to show that he suspected something about her. He wondered if she was trying to beat him to get ahead. However, she might also see him as just an outsider. This girl was smart and quite impressive. All this time, Josh didn't understand what was happening, so he asked the senior why he was acting so weird. When he got no response again, he suddenly ran up to Tony, grabbed him by the neck, started laughing, and asked how long he was going to ignore him. When the guys finally started talking, Tony asked what he'd been thinking about all this time. Turns out, the senior didn't even realize he was ignoring the guy. He said that Samantha had invited him to dinner. Josh was totally shocked since Samantha was the new Team C leader and the girl who got second place in the midterm test. Tony pointed out that he was talking about her with too much enthusiasm. Suddenly, Josh hesitated and asked Tony why he was looking at him like that, considering everyone knows they call that girl the goddess of the trainee center. As it turned out, she's been called that since she first arrived here. When Josh started praising her way too much, Tony asked him to stop. Then Josh asked him when they were meeting up. Tony said their meeting at his place is happening right now, and suddenly, Josh started thinking about how Tony took first place, Samantha second, and he himself ended up third. Then he asked if it was really all just a weird twist of fate. Tony said it wasn't a coincidence, but an alliance. He asked Josh if he ever thought about joining the strategic planning department. Josh asked why he was bringing this up so suddenly, wondering if the strategic planning department was the main goal of this dinner. Then Tony said that originally, Samantha planned to meet just with him, but he wasn't too keen, so he asked Josh to join. Josh is also at the top of the list, so that's why he decided to invite him. He apologized for not mentioning it earlier, but Josh said it was all good. He said that ever since he started university, this had been his goal. Tony smirked, realizing that he had just made that up on the spot. Meanwhile, Samantha was already waiting for Tony at the cafe entrance. She was a bit upset that he was running late. Soon, she saw Tony coming around the corner. She was thrilled and immediately wanted to get up and go meet him. But just a moment later, another guy came out following him, someone she had never seen before. This really threw her off. Tony greeted her, but Samantha told him she thought he would come alone. Tony replied that he thought she wouldn't come alone either. Soon, the three of them went into the cafe and ordered some food. Tony was confused, not understanding what was going on or what Samantha was thinking. Then the hero turned to her and said that having dinner with her meant a lot to him. The girl said the feeling was mutual. She was glad to meet such a talented guy, and it was a pity they were dining in such an unremarkable place. She thought Tony had never eaten anything like this before. Tony and Josh were surprised by her words. The hero watched the girl closely, trying to figure out what she meant. Samantha said, slightly annoyed, that they had taken first and third places in the midterm test, and it was quite impressive. Tony didn't mention how hard they had tried. She herself had come in second, which was also a very respectable result. However, Samantha didn't respond, just silently continued eating her food. Soon it was late evening, and all three of them left the cafe. Samantha mentioned that Tony's team had become like a family, while Team C had already earned a reputation. Despite last night's incident, the interns are totally in the dark, and it's not an isolated case. She recalled a video where some guy was recording gymnastics for the team. People said he showed great results from day one, and there were 5 people in the video. Because of this, the training director got really mad. Then Samantha asked if Tony knew that the whole Team C sees him as a show-off, because none of them thought to record the gymnastics first. In the end, each member of Team C had a 1/4 point docked from their rating, so they decided to change their leader. Tony said he was sorry, but Samantha told him that it was thanks to him she got this position. Then Josh asked if this meeting was really set up to scope out the competition and clear the way for the strategic planning owners. Tony tried to stop him, but the girl said she had nothing to hide and added that there was some truth to it. She wondered about the person who had outperformed her in the tests and wanted to meet them in person. Then she heard about the night incident involving him again, and it piqued her interest even more. Her desire to learn from Tony only grew. That was her motive. She's really aiming to get into the strategic planning department, and she was curious about what the guys think. Tony said he hasn't really decided anything yet. He's just doing his best day by day. The girl said that's kind of disappointing since everyone's doing their best. Besides, she didn't understand where else Tony could aim for if not the strategic planning department. She asked him to think about it because she didn't know what the others were expecting, but she could understand him. Then Samantha pondered if there was a surefire way to make it into the top 5. Tony said he's not sure if that's possible, and even if there is a way, wouldn't it be better to let someone from Team C have a chance? Then Josh suddenly chimed in, saying that actually Tony also wants to be in the strategic planning department. He's been thinking about it for a long time, and he even has some proposals. Samantha said that's good, but he should speak for himself about it. Because if he's not interested in the strategic planning department, then their meeting was a waste of time. Tony asked her if she really meant to say that only those in the top 5 could make it into strategic planning, to which Samantha affirmed. So George said that with the team and Samantha, they're 6, but if only the top players have a chance, someone's out of luck. The girl said not all of them could pull it off. After all, they're competitors. Josh didn't get what she was talking about. Then Tony explained that she wanted them to split up. Samantha suggested having the negotiations at her place. Being a former cheerleader, she's got some advantages in team games. Her coach even said she'd be the female team leader. The max points you can score are 150, and if you act as a female or male team leader, you get an extra 50. So she's aiming for the top spot with those bonus points. She said she'd give Tony the male team leader spot, and that it would help him solidify his position as the best intern down the line. Then the hero asked what she wanted in return for such an offer, since she'd take first place anyway if he didn't become the leader. Then the girl took a sip from her glass. Next, she said she wanted to join them and asked to be taken on as a member. Tony was totally surprised that she wanted to be part of their team. When you think about it, everyone in the top 6 is part of their group, except for the intern in second place. So Tony figured she actually wants to keep an eye on them. Personally, he didn't care whether she joined or not, but he needed to know how the others would react. He said he'd ask the group members what they think about it, since it wasn't just his call to make. Then they promised to touch base with each other a bit later. When Tony got back to the training center, he shared with his intern about who wants to join the group. He said it's Samantha, the team leader of Team C. One of the interns was extremely happy about the news and said he totally agrees. The girl was also thrilled, saying that Samantha is like a goddess among the interns at the training center. A guy backed her up, saying she's got it all, brains and beauty. He asked where she was now and asked to bring her over right away. But Tony stopped him, saying she wouldn't just join them like that. She'd make him the male leader in mass games. Then one of the interns said it didn't matter since she had asked to join their group herself and that she was really jealous of her beauty and femininity. The other girls agreed with her too, so the whole team was on board with Samantha joining them. Tony thought their reaction was way better than he expected. Soon the clock struck 10 in the evening. The training team was deep in active discussions. At that moment, Samantha walked into the office and greeted everyone there. She said she was planning to join their group. The hero noted that it was surprising how quickly she showed up. The other interns immediately rushed over to the girl and started asking her about various things. Time flew by. A whole week has passed since then. One of the interns asked if Samantha had finished her tasks, but the girl said she was more interested in something else. She asked if Tony wasn't an amazing person. He only explains the crucial points, which can sometimes be hard to grasp on your own. To herself, she pondered how he talks about the essentials as if he had learned everything beforehand. It's impossible unless he's the director's grandson. A few days later, the test results were posted again in the hallway, and Tony was at the top once more. However, he noticed that one of his interns was no longer in the top ranks, and the guy said he did his best. Then Tony asked him to work even harder next time since they are in the same study group. The guy said his results were pretty normal, and he couldn't measure up to learning monsters like him and Samantha. But our hero still urged him to give it his all, as there's nothing beyond his reach. He figured that soon the guy would outpace him. Samantha noted to herself that Tony was really good at building relationships. Usually people avoid the top intern, seeing them as a competitor. She guessed it was all due to his calm nature, his leadership skills, and his great sense of humor. She assumed that's exactly why people liked him. However, Samantha wondered if a grandson of a powerful family didn't have any weaknesses. Then she smiled, thinking about how busy this guy was. Soon, Tony headed to one of the offices since he needed to prepare a presentation, and it turned out to be harder than he thought. Josh approached him, asking if his presentation was ready since he'd need to present soon. Realizing Tony wasn't ready yet, he offered his help, but the guy said he needed to handle it on his own, though he thanked his friend for the offer. The protagonist frantically tried to figure out what to write on the next slide. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but time was ticking away. Suddenly, the system popped up above his head again, saying new products were available in the store. He got 2 points for keeping the top spot in the rankings for 2 consecutive weeks. The more points he had, the more rare items he could buy from the store. In the store, he could choose either the ability to memorize all the PowerPoint functions or to create the perfect presentation. Tony was pleasantly surprised by such a decent selection of products. Soon it was time for the presentation, and Tony pulled it off successfully. Josh said he did a great job, and the rest of his team backed him up too. The guy guessed that the team leader would take the top spot again. He told Tony he did a great job, especially since it was his first time. But the hero said he was exaggerating and being subjective. To himself, the hero thought that it wasn't the first time. He had learned a lot on construction sites, and he had performed physical exercises in front of an audience of over 600 people. He even argued with someone he just met about the scale of the construction work. Sometimes you had to work hard for several days to get paid. He always needed to be confident, believing that he could combine hard work and a sense of responsibility. But that wasn't all he needed. He also had to think rationally to earn a decent income without suffering losses. Compared to him, his colleagues weren't as socially developed, but they'd get used to it soon. He was just lucky because people from various circles he knew since childhood really helped him out. Yet he was also worried about something else. He had gone so far, staying at the top, but he wondered if he could reflect his success at the training center in real life. He knew for sure it wouldn't work out because not everything would always go his way, but he decided he'd get used to that. Soon, there was a gathering of graduates from different universities at the training center. Tony sat in the stands watching what was happening. At that moment, Marvin approached him and asked why he was there alone. He told Tony that he should head back to the office since he wasn't on the list of university graduates. But the hero said there was no need. The boss told him that education wasn't everything, so there was no need to be so upset. But Tony couldn't help himself. So Marvin sat down next to him and asked him to go somewhere with him. Tony didn't get where he was being led, but Marvin told him he just had to follow orders since he's his boss. Soon, they stepped out of the training center into the courtyard. Marvin told him that the CEO of Elsung Group really likes pools and saunas, so every building they own is equipped with them. Then he suggested they go to the sauna together. He mentioned that the alumni meeting would last another 2 hours, and they had nothing to do there for so long. But Tony asked if it wouldn't be weird to spend so much time in the sauna. He admitted it was quite unusual since he previously only used the pool and sauna at construction sites. Marvin said that the director's horoscope doesn't have many water signs, so when the company was just founded, there were some incidents which were funny. But such a large company makes decisions according to Chinese feng shui and star positions. With that, Tony agreed to go to the sauna with his boss. The man noted that the intern has a pretty solid body. Tony thanked him and mentioned that Marvin also had a pretty good physique. Marvin said he needed to pay more attention to his fitness since he wasn't getting any younger. And working in sales wasn't easy, as he often got invited for drinks to negotiate discounts. Seizing the moment, he decided to offer Tony something. He asked him to come to the sales department and promised to teach him everything. The hero was a bit surprised by such an unexpected offer. Then Marvin said that he didn't need connections with classmates for this. He mentioned that it didn't really matter where he was from or what he had done, as long as he was diligent and hardworking. Then Tony apologized and said he still needed time to make a decision. After that, he fell silent for a moment. Then he pinched his nose and dipped underwater. Underwater, he saw the system window again. It announced that he had completed a hidden mission, defeated a new program, and now could heal his back. As a reward, He received a healing elixir that could cure all ailments. Soon after, Marvin and Tony headed to the bathhouse. Marvin decided it was time to reiterate his offer. He told Tony that success was guaranteed if he worked with him, and he would make sure of it. However, the hero expressed his doubts, and not without reason. Marvin asked him what was making him doubtful. Tony said he aimed to join the strategic planning department. Marvin was surprised by such a response, but Tony showed with all his demeanor that he was determined. After that, the men went into a cold bath, and Marvin said that joining that department was a bad idea, as it would break him. He said that most people got there through connections, and in his opinion, no one would likely help him, and the strategic planning department wouldn't get him anywhere in life. He insisted that Tony shouldn't overthink it, because their world isn't as glamorous as it might seem at first, especially the strategic planning department where all the elites gather. He again asked the guy to join him, since in the sales department at least people would recognize and value his efforts. Tony said he'd take his words into consideration, then asked why he knew so much about all this. Marvin said that initially, he too wanted to get into the planning department. But then he saw and experienced what the elite were capable of. He finished his training at the center ranking 4th in the top, so he got a chance to join the planning department. Then he asked Tony if he knew that to enter that department, he needed to work in every position for a year. Marvin himself failed the final selection, wasting a whole year. He said the reason was his education. He graduated from a less popular university than his competitors. That made Tony think about what happened to the university's graduates. If that's the case, he now understood why Marvin was so keen on promoting the sales department to him. However, he thought about how he could join the sales department any time, while the chance to get into the strategic planning department was once in a lifetime. He felt bad about upsetting Marvin, but he had already made up his mind. He was dead set on getting into the strategic planning department. Soon, a new day of classes began at the training center. In room 127, one of the interns was sitting alone when a man came up to him and asked if he had settled in with the company. Realizing the guy didn't recognize him, he introduced himself as the manager's assistant and said his name was Chester. However, the guy had no clue how Chester knew him. It turned out, this intern was a third-generation employee of Elsung Group named Tony, who got his position through the company's vice president, his father, and was currently ranking last in the top list. Chester said that he once met him at Jix University during an academic meeting, but Tony didn't want to listen to him. He asked him not to pretend they knew each other and to stop spouting nonsense. He said that it must remain a secret that he was here. Chester honestly said he understood, adding that he never thought he'd run into Tony here like this. So Tony asked him to stop sucking up and asked what he could teach him. Chester said he had a couple of exam questions from previous years, but Tony was more interested in where he could have some fun. When he realized Chester didn't know the answer to that, he said he was no use to him. Then he sent the guy to buy him something fizzy. When Chester left, Tony swore under his breath, not understanding why he had to put up with this, especially since he wasn't even getting the director's spot. He knew his granddad was planning to hand over his position to his dad, and his dad was too greedy. Suddenly, he wondered if Chester could be one of his dad's people. Meanwhile, Chester headed to the board where the test results were hanging and saw Tony's name at the top. He felt happy for the young sir and thought the vice president would be pleased to hear he was top of the list again. Soon, one of the employees went to the vice president to report that Tony hadn't topped the list for the first and second week. He said it was a smart move to give him some of the exam questions in advance, and the man replied that his only son had been quite a handful, but now it seemed like he had settled down. Then the man asked how the director was feeling. The man said, "Unfortunately, he's in good health. The doctor says the old guy will last at least another 10 years, and the man was really annoyed that he was hanging on for so long." Then the man mentioned that doctors always say stuff like that, but maybe the director is hiding his real health condition. The man said he needed to gather as many shares as possible and secure the rights to manage the company. He explained that they were buying them bit by bit, using close partners, but it would take some time. Meanwhile, at the training center, preparations were in full swing, with interns bringing their senior different colored flags. Samantha asked each intern to take 2 flags and check their order against the diagram. Tony said that in that case, they should pick the flags in the necessary order. Then Samantha suggested they first watch last year's video and use it as a guide for their practice, and maybe try adding some new color. Tony suggested sticking to the plan, confident that they'd handle it. The interns shared his vibe, saying they'd make it together. So the prep for the games began. Samantha and Tony showed the interns how they were going to perform. Before practice started, Tony, as the team leader, distributed his earned points among his mates. The other interns were glad they weren't in their seniors' shoes. The rest would practice tomorrow, but now they needed to sort out the flags. Soon, Tony addressed them via the loudspeaker, asking them to make sure everyone took 2 flags each. All of Tony's mates expressed their huge gratitude, probably mostly because of the point distribution. The practice went smoothly, but that didn't mean they had no issues at all. One of the interns approached Tony, asking him to take this session seriously, but the guy was puzzled about who he was to tell him what to do. The intern didn't know what to do since it was a tricky situation, so he decided to just call the senior. He mentioned that his namesake was doing nothing but playing on his phone. Then Tony said he'd definitely have a word with him. Then he headed to the corner of the room where his namesake was sitting. He said he'd never seen him around before and asked if his name was Tony too. He wanted to know what was bothering him here because if that was the case, he could help out. Then Tony just asked to be left alone, and the senior said that in that case, it might be better to kick him off the team. Tony was surprised by that response. Then the senior said he'd take him out and claim he was injured since they had too many people on the team anyway. Tony was pleased with that decision, asking if he really would take responsibility for the consequences. A few days later, the mass games began. As expected, Samantha and Tony were the leaders. Almost all the interns participated in the mass games. Then Tony announced that the training center was launching its 68th mass games. He raised his hand high, shouting the team's battle cry. All this was closely watched by the company executives and journalists. One of the executives approached the director. He mentioned that the atmosphere in the training center was surprisingly pleasant. He added that these 2 leaders had some great energy coming off them. Looks like they were worth paying attention to. Then Philip said that, from the looks of it, Tony and Samantha wouldn't leave any chance for others to clinch the first and second spots in the final selection. The boss was totally shocked when he heard the name Tony. Meanwhile, the new test scores were posted on the board, and Tony, the boss's grandson, found his name next to last. He couldn't understand why the same thing kept happening for the 3rd week in a row, and couldn't believe that everyone else was just studying non-stop. However, he knew he couldn't let his dad find out about this. Just then, his phone rang. It turned out he got a message that his card limit had been increased. He didn't understand why this had happened and guessed that his dad must be in a good mood. Meanwhile, at the company, there was a meeting of executives where it was decided to watch a video of the mass games involving new employees, initiated by the founder of Elsung Group. One of the men turned to the director, Christopher, and reported that Tony had topped the leaderboard at the training center. He said that Tony had a great chance of winning, with the 2nd place trailing by a whole 18 points. Christopher was very surprised that his grandson finally came out on top, and thought that he must have pulled some kind of trick. Then another man approached the director, saying he had been at those mass games. He said it was his first time seeing Tony, and he seemed like a noble young man. He was impressed because the guy sang well and skillfully managed the mass games. Christopher couldn't believe what the men were saying. The CEO doesn't throw around compliments for no reason, so Christopher decided to check out his grandson's success when he watches the video. He couldn't figure out when Tony had become a leader, but thought maybe he finally decided to settle down. Soon, the lights were turned off in the room so everyone could see the video recording. The screen showed an image that depicted the beginning of the mass games. On stage were Samantha and Tony, who were the leaders of the games. Soon, Tony's face was shown in close-up on the screen. Then the CEO turned to the manager, saying that his grandson had a well-trained voice. But Tony's dad, Matthew, figured out that this guy wasn't his son. Christopher wasn't too surprised, since he knew Tony would never change overnight. Still, there was something he was curious about. He wanted to know who this young man was, sharing his grandson's name. Then he remembered meeting the guy in a sauna just recently. He wished him luck with his endeavors. That's when he realized this was the same guy he met at the construction site, and he was glad he joined Elson Group. After the meeting ended, the CEO said he couldn't believe Tony had grown up and become part of their company. Then he asked the director why he had hidden him for so long. To his surprise, Christopher answered that it wasn't his grandson. He said he personally knew the guy who took first place. Then he asked his son when the training program would finish, and Matthew said it ends next week. That's when Christopher decided he might just drop by. When Matthew was alone, he decided to call his son. He was extremely frustrated with everything that was happening. He asked his assistant to bring Tony to him right now. But at that moment, Tony was in one of the upscale bars. The bartender told him he racked up a bill of 247,001. Then Tony said he was treating everyone today since his card was finally unfrozen. He told the bartender he'd pay the whole amount right away. However, when he tried to use his card, something went wrong. The bartender asked if he had another card, as the system was showing that this one was blocked. Tony said it was impossible since it was his dad's card. Then he handed him another one, but the ATM still refused to accept the card. The bartender informed him that the card had been reported lost. Tony couldn't understand what had happened with his dad's card, especially since he had just raised the limit. Then the bartender asked if he had another card. Realizing the guy had no working cards or cash, he said he'd have to call the police in that case. Soon it was time for the intern's excursion, and everyone headed to the mountains. The tour guide asked everyone to let him know in advance if they couldn't participate in the hike due to health issues. Tony was sitting with Marvin, and the supervisor asked him how he felt at the end of the training period, to which our hero replied that he was quite satisfied. Marvin said it looked like he'd stay in first place till the end, which was impressive, but the hero mentioned there was still one more step to go. Meanwhile, Samantha was just staring out the window, totally indifferent. The other interns were happily chatting among themselves. By evening, the bus reached the destination, and Tony told his team that it was dangerous to walk around at night, so the interns needed to always stick together in pairs. Soon, all the interns headed for the mountains. The hero looked back to check on his team once more. All the interns obediently followed him and Marvin. Like this, the guys climbed the mountains for a while. At some point, Tony suddenly felt a sharp wave of fatigue. Then he just stopped, unable to breathe, and Marvin immediately grabbed his shoulders, asking what was wrong. That's when Tony suddenly said that his back was really hurting. The next moment he screamed in pain, unable to bear the sensations. They had to stop, and that's when Tony shared his story with Marvin, asking how long he's been living with it and if he had any painkillers. He asked Tony to mention his back inflammation right away next time because you can't hike on meds. But Tony said that bowing out due to health would disqualify him. He had no choice. He turned to Marvin, asking if he could possibly overlook this situation. Then the leader asked if he could continue, to which Tony replied that he would have to. He said he would reach the top again. But he asked Marvin one more time to do him a favor and pretend he never saw anything. Then the leader asked him why he even agreed to such distances. Tony thought to himself that if he gave up now, he might as well have not started at all. After a while, he realized his back was starting to hurt again. Apparently, the painkillers were wearing off, but he couldn't give up now. He had to hang in there till the end, even if it was going to hurt like hell. That way, he made it to the mountaintop with Marvin and took a memorable photo there. Soon, all the interns returned back to the training center. As the training was coming to an end, Marvin took the stage to award those who had achieved incredible results. He asked some people to come up on stage, including Samantha. Tony also got up from his seat. So, Tony, Samantha, that guy Oliver who had been watching the couple a few days ago, Josh and another intern from Tony's team stepped onto the stage. Marvin announced that for a special reason, the director himself would personally hand out awards to each of them. Then he asked everyone to welcome Director Christopher. When Tony turned to look at the man, his face twisted in surprise. He heard that the director rarely makes media appearances. Christopher stepped onto the stage and waved to everyone present. That's when it hit Tony. He remembered that day he was in the sauna with some old guy, and now he realized that old guy was Director Christopher himself. Tony looked at the man, unsure how to act. Samantha looked at Christopher with respect. She thought to herself about how she had come back here after 10 years owing him. Marvin said that Tony's employee had received an award for persistence in keeping the top spot during the training program for new workers. Then Christopher asked him how he was feeling. Tony timidly replied that he was shocked and could barely believe what was happening. Then the director handed him a certificate, congratulating him for his excellent work, urging him not to rest on his laurels and to keep reaching for incredible heights. Tony accepted the certificate, still in disbelief that he was actually standing here, on this stage. Then Christopher turned to Samantha, telling her she wasn't as lucky, that she would have been first if last year's standards were applied. However, he encouraged her not to lose her drive for excellence, as their company needed more talents like her. To herself, the girl reflected that all this happened only because of Christopher's support, which had cured her heart disease. She thanked the director and accepted the certificate. With that, the training program for new employees was concluded. The trainees headed to their rooms to pack up, and now Tony just had to wait for the results to find out into which department they would be placed based on their first, second, and third choices. For now, he had 5 days off to relax. During this time, all interns will receive information on their department assignments. Tony knew he had just one more thing to sort out, namely, to use the reward he got from a hidden quest. Soon, the hero arrived at the hospital where his mother was admitted. He knew he had to hurry. He wondered if this elixir could cure his mother, but he was also worried about what to do with his own back. However, that wasn't as important because if his mom got better, his back issues would naturally become less of a concern. Soon, the guy stopped in front of the oncology department door. He pulled the elixir out of his pocket. A few days earlier, Hannah's doctor, Hank, had informed him that the breast cancer had spread to the lymph nodes, lungs, and liver, and that further treatment at their hospital was not possible. Hank immediately yelled, asking what they meant since this was the best hospital in Korea. The doctor asked him to calm down, pointing out that he was a doctor too, and if anyone should know what was happening with the woman, it was him. Then they asked Hank if there really was no other way. The doctor said the best thing to do was to spend her last moments with her, as that's what the patient herself wanted. After that, Hank went to Hannah's room, where she told him not to worry. She said her sister would pick her up in 3 hours and that he should go home. But Hank insisted, saying he would pick her up and take care of her himself. He packed her things into a suitcase, settled her into a wheelchair, and said they were going home. At that moment, Hannah's son entered the room. Hank was upset to see Tony there because he knew he had to break the bad news to him. Hannah was also surprised to see her son there. The hero didn't get why they were suddenly discharging his mom. Then he knelt before her, and Hannah told him she wanted to go home. But Tony asked why she was in a wheelchair since her treatment wasn't finished yet. Hannah gave a pained smile, saying she had her reasons. But Tony didn't want to hear it. He said he'd fix everything. Then Hannah hugged him tightly and held him close. She started crying, saying how sorry she was. When evening came, Hank called a taxi to go somewhere alone with Hannah. She asked why he wanted to ride separately, and he said he wanted to discuss something privately with her. Then he turned away, not sure where to start, but decided to just say it as it is. He asked Hannah to marry him. The woman was shocked by such a proposal. She asked what he was talking about since he needed to live his own life. Hank said that this is his life, and he regrets letting Hannah go to her husband a long time ago. They could have lived happily together if that hadn't happened. He said he believes her husband would have supported them from heaven, and he will take responsibility for Hannah's life and be there until one of them dies. Hannah cried, saying she would just be a burden in his life, but Hank said he didn't want to have any regrets anymore. Soon evening came, and Tony arrived at his mother's apartment. He carried his suitcase upstairs. However, when he opened the room door, he realized there was no one at home. At that moment, Hank came out of Hannah's room, saying she had fallen asleep after taking some painkillers. After that, the guys headed to the living room, an awkward silence hanging between them. Hank mentioned he had to go, but would be back soon with his stuff since he planned to stay there for a while. Hearing this, Tony smiled and approved of his decision. He walked him to the exit, watching as he got dressed. Before leaving, Hank turned around and addressed Tony. He asked him not to worry about his mom, as he would take care of her. Then he added that Tony could call him if anything happened. When Hank left, Tony went to the room where his mother was. He sat beside her on the bed, thinking to himself about all she had been through. Then he reached into his jacket. Soon he pulled out a small bottle with a colorful liquid inside. He said he wanted to give this elixir to his mom. He tilted the bottle downwards, intending to hand it to Hannah, but it wouldn't pour out. Tony examined the bottle closely, puzzled as to why the liquid wasn't flowing. Then the system informed him that the liquid would automatically pour when he brought it to the right place of use. And so Tony tilted the elixir towards his mother's lips again. And then the liquid flowed. As the liquid touched her lips, his mother's bed suddenly lit up with a bright light. He intended to give his mom the whole bottle, but after she drank half, the liquid stopped flowing again. The system told him that he had used enough and asked Tony to use the remainder to heal his own back. That's when Tony realized the system knew he would use the elixir to heal his mom, not himself. Some time passed, and then morning came. When Hannah woke up, she was surprised to find that her body didn't hurt at all. She couldn't believe what had happened. It felt like some kind of miracle. Tony watched his mom with a smile. Then he turned to the bottle and said he didn't know who was behind all this, but he was immensely grateful to them. Soon after, Hank arrived at the apartment. He still couldn't quite believe the woman could walk down the stairs on her own. He offered to carry her, but Hannah said she was fine. She didn't understand how it was possible. At first, she thought she was still dreaming. Then Hank suggested they see a doctor to find out what he would say. And in the meantime, she shouldn't strain herself. As it turned out, the tests confirmed that all the cancer cells had completely disappeared from Hannah's body. The treating doctor accepted the results, though he found them hard to believe. Mr. Hank, being a doctor of another specialty, just couldn't accept what was happening without proper medical explanation. But in the end, he had no other choice. He stepped out of the office and sat down next to Hannah and Tony, saying that miracles do happen, but they needed to keep a very close eye on her health. After some time, Hannah, Hank, and Tony finally adjusted to the current state of affairs, and his life as a full-fledged working hero began. He arrived at the Elsung Group's main office headquarters, and at that moment, one of the employees came up to them, asking if the rest had received their salaries since they were supposed to get 3 million. But it turned out he only got 221,001. Then Josh told him that the boss said they'd only get 80% of the rate during their internship. Then he turned to Oliver, who was the leader of Team A. The guy said his name was Clyde, and that he was pleased to meet the team leader. He mentioned that they were all pretty much around 26, but Tony said he was just 25, explaining that he started school early. Oliver said that he was turning 28 this year. He studied abroad and joined the company a bit later. Clyde and he decided they would look out for each other. At that moment, Albert, the director of strategic planning, approached them. He said they didn't have much time and asked everyone to head to the conference room. Once everyone arrived, he welcomed all the employees in his department and mentioned that he wasn't sure if they had heard, but the planning department takes on employees who have been with Elsung Group for 3 years, after which they decide which 5 people will stay. So Josh said he had a question, wondering what they were supposed to do for the next 2 years while waiting to be admitted to the department. Lebo then said that they all know what to do, calling strategic planning the pride of Elsung Group. He then asked the workers what happens when a flower doesn't bloom, and Josh replied that in that case, the flower can't reproduce. Connor said that without blooming, there's no reproduction, and without reproduction, it can't grow, which will lead to its wilting. The company must continue to grow for a future in the global market. A wilting company won't survive. That's why everyone here needs to be ready to become the flower, to join their department, and to achieve the goal they need to excel in multiple areas. They can't teach how to become the flower. That's something the workers have to achieve on their own, as real growth is only fostered by personal experience. Then he pulled out tiny rolled-up sheets from a pen, saying these listed the departments where the workers need to work. They have to pick one each, starting from the bottom of the evaluation list. Tony couldn't believe he was relying on chance. First up was Clyde, who said he landed in the 3rd team for life insurance sales. Josh said he got the electronics quality control department at Elsung Group. Oliver said he's in the HR department. Samantha said she's in the electronics and appliances sales department. Tony wanted to mention the department he ended up in, but Albert stopped him. He said he doesn't need to say it out loud, since there's only one department left anyway. Then he addressed the employees, saying that in 2 months he'll get reports on their work and their achievements from the department heads, and those will be used to assess their abilities. At that, Clyde asked what would happen after those 2 months, and Albert said they would be transferred to another department based on today's principle. A few days later, Tony was sitting at the bus stop waiting for his bus, but just before his stop, a black car pulled up. Hank leaned out and said he'd give him a lift to the station, otherwise he'd be late on his first day of work. He said he knew Tony's office address since he had it saved on his phone. He was lucky to work close to his company, and he also told the guy not to worry, saying he used to live in that area, and the guy could stay with them until he gets married. Tony said he wasn't worried. He was even grateful to have a place to stay in Seoul, and if it wasn't for Hank, he would have had to make the trip alone or look for a studio. Then the doctor asked him how his back was. The hero hesitated, not sure what to say. Memories of the day he gave half of the healing elixir to his mother flashed through his mind. After that, the system asked him to use the remaining potion to heal his back. Tony obediently drank the rest of the elixir. Right after that, he felt no pain in his back anymore. At that moment, he heard his mother's voice from behind the door. When he realized his mom wanted to see him right now and tell him she's feeling great, the system immediately told Tony he needed to hurry up and hide the elixir. A few seconds later, the woman opened the door and asked what her son was doing there. Now Hank said that if Tony needed painkillers, he could ask him for some. It might ease the pain. But it was only a matter of time. He said he wouldn't talk about it to his mom, but the surgery shouldn't be delayed. Then Tony, with a smile, said he'd swing by soon so he could check his back. Hank smiled warmly and looked at the guy. Meanwhile, the story shifts to a branch of the life insurance sales department. Marvin paced back and forth in the department, unsure what to do. Then he suddenly saw a new notice on the display board and immediately went over. He was thrilled to see Tony's name on the list of the department's new employees. Just then, the branch manager came up to him, and Marvin immediately addressed him. He mentioned that a new worker was coming in today and he was bringing him up to speed. But the manager mentioned hearing about him losing a lot of money because they made him a manager. Marvin said that in return, they got a capable worker since Tony is a really smart guy, and he wanted to show him around and teach him a few things. The manager said if he's so eager to help him, he'd lend him a hand. He mentioned that the new guy was currently at the coffee shop on the first floor. Apparently, he forgot his pass. Then he asked Marvin to go down there and bring the worker up. Marvin replied that it didn't sound like Tony at all. When he went downstairs, he saw a guy he didn't recognize at all. Tony, the vice president's son, told him he was now the new employee of the company. He was casually sipping his coffee and didn't even stand up to greet his team leader, whom he remembered from the training center. Meanwhile, the story shifts to the main office of Elson Group. Tony arrived at his new job only to find out Oliver was working there too. The guys realized they'd been assigned to the same department. Tony half-jokingly asked if the HR department didn't realize they were there through the strategic planning division. Oliver laughed and said it seemed like they were out of the loop. Soon, the men reached the office they were looking for. Inside was a girl, and they greeted her right away. The girl figured out they were the new employees and asked them to wait on the sofa for a few minutes. Oliver and Tony headed to the sofa, waiting for the girl to come over to them. She soon approached them, saying she was sure they recognized her from the personality assessment tests. Tony immediately noticed she had turned her badge away from them, hiding her name. Then Tony suddenly remembered the day he took the test. The girl introduced herself as Kimberly, saying she joined the company in 2017 and was looking forward to working together productively. He then told her that he remembered her and how she joined the company, and she commented that he had a really good memory since he even remembered her name. He didn't mention that the results of their personality assessment were truly impressive. He was so surprised when he saw it, that's why he remembered. Just then, another man walked into the office and asked how Kimberly was doing with her progress. She said that the new employees remembered her name. Apparently, they did quite well on the personality tests. Then the man, whose badge was also tucked away in his pocket, asked Oliver if he remembered his name. The guy was confused. He didn't understand how this man knew his name, and moreover, he didn't know why he should remember the man's name. He decided he needed to guess the man's name to earn their good favor, So he guessed that the man's name might be Marvin. Hearing that, the guy was super annoyed. So Oliver decided to admit that he couldn't remember his own name. Kimberly said that was fine since it had been 2 months since they met. But the guy said that if he wanted to make a good impression, they should be shooting in the dark. He asked Oliver if he was planning to guess the names of the clients he would be working with. Then he turned to Tony, asking if he remembered his name. The hero said he was Connor's assistant manager, who joined the corporation back in 2014. Then Connor shook his hand, complimenting him on his good memory. He said Kimberly was keeping them in the loop, and their first task was to sort resumes. But the girl said they would later join the strategic planning department and doubted whether they could be trusted with information and personal data. Connor said that when he first came here, they had him working all over without caring about personal data, so they should let them get into the workflow. They'll be out of their department soon enough. They're not their people anyway. Tony was surprised they knew they were applying to the planning department. Then Kimberly laughed, saying maybe they'd change their minds and stay here, just like she did herself, since they need workers too. Then Connor said he didn't care, as it wasn't up to him anyway, and left the office. Kimberly explained to the guys that, truth be told, she too admired strategic planning and dreamed of working there. But after trying many other jobs, she suddenly realized that HR was the best fit for her and decided to stay. Tony realized that meant Kimberly was also one of the top interns back in her day. The girl asked him if he knew what human resources management involved. Tony said that as far as he knew, the job includes periodic training sessions, involves staffing, like for government or special importance jobs, and the department is also responsible for reassigning employees. Kimberly smiled, saying it looks like he did his homework, adding that they handle everything related to staff and its management, their main task being to gather and structure employee data into a database. Then she asked the guys if they were familiar with the office software of their company, to which the men replied affirmatively. She said they currently have about 3,000 applications for special assignment workers, so she asked them to sort them by criteria: location abroad, 3 years of experience, and their department. The men would be working on this together, so they should divide the tasks. Tony and Oliver agreed right away. Oliver said there were only 3,000 applications, so they should split them in half. He asked Tony to handle the first 1,500, and he'd take care of the second half. Tony asked him if he really thought they'd finish faster that way. Oliver asked him if he really disagreed with him. Then Kimberly asked them to hurry up and get started, as she needed it done by the evening. Oliver immediately got ready and said he'd start working right now. So they worked for 3 hours. Tony was almost done. He just needed to transfer the information from the documents into a spreadsheet, which wouldn't take long. However, Oliver wasn't doing as well. The work was really draining him, and he wasn't sure he'd finish by evening. Then Tony got up from his seat and walked over to Oliver, asking if he was done. And the man was surprised, asking if he had already sorted his part. The hero said that the program has an auto-filter and search feature, which he used to sort the data by categories, and now all he had to do was print the documents. Oliver said that it looks like he won't be able to finish today, and he didn't know what to do. Then Tony said that he took care of his half of the documents too, and they could say they did it all together. Oliver couldn't believe his partner had helped him so much. The hero said that you need to respect your mates and love your country, and then everything will be all right. Then he called Kimberly, saying that they finished the work together. They got it done much faster. The girl initially didn't believe it and double-checked, asking if they were sure they could send her the finished file. Then Tony said he would send it through the corporate email. When Kimberly checked their document, she noted that everything looked quite good, and she told the manager's assistant that the new workers were pretty good. Connor smirked and then asked if they smoked. Oliver raised his hand and said that he did smoke. Then he invited him to the rooftop and also asked if Tony wanted to join them. However, the guy thanked him for the invite but had to decline. Soon after, Oliver and Connor headed to the smoking area on the rooftop of the main office. Connor asked him how his first day was going, but Oliver himself wasn't quite sure yet. Connor told him not to worry, as it's always tough at the beginning, but he'll get used to it. Oliver was really hoping so. Then Connor asked him how well he knew Tony. Oliver said he knew him pretty well. He had been the leader of Team A while Tony led Team B during training. Connor said this guy, the leader of the top team who joined the strategic planning department, seems to know he's the best of the best. He said Tony is incredible for many reasons. He didn't graduate from a prestigious university. He made it all happen with a student loan, and he's doing just great here. The only work experience he had was manual labor, which is of no use in the office. Oliver couldn't believe that Tony used to earn his keep through physical labor. Connor asked if he really didn't know about it. Oliver said he had no idea since they only met at the training center. He mentioned that, according to HR, Tony's situation is fundamentally different from Oliver's. He asked the guy to be nicer to his partner since he's older. Oliver smiled and said that was true. Then Connor headed back inside, saying he always enjoys making friends with his colleagues, and told Oliver not to be wary of Tony just because their ranks differ. When Oliver realized the seniors here were so kind and caring, he smiled. Soon after, the evening came. Tony and Oliver were walking together after work when the guy asked the hero if the team doesn't throw a party for the newbies. Tony said that nobody does that anymore. Then Oliver suggested they celebrate their first day at work, and Tony asked him where he wanted to go. Oliver said he knew a little place. Soon the men arrived at a small food stall. They sat down at a table, and Oliver asked the vendor to bring them some soup with a fish pie and 2 bottles of soju. He poured the drink into Tony's glass and offered him to drink up. Then he asked him where he was from. Tony said he came from Cheonan, and he had also heard that Oliver was from Socho. The guy mentioned that they both come from small towns and it wouldn't hurt to get to know each other better. He said that since they joined the company at the same time, they could talk to him in a way that feels comfortable and drop all the formalities. Tony smiled and agreed to the suggestion. Just then, a message popped up on his phone. Clyde was ranting about how Tony annoys him. The hero was puzzled, not understanding why he was involved or why he was annoying someone. Then he clarified that he wasn't talking about him. He reminded Tony about his annoying namesake and explained that today their boss from the training center had signed a contract with a female client regarding insurance. However, Tony was standing right there, looming over her, arms crossed and glaring. The client immediately started to complain, asking why this young man was staring at her like that. Turns out, the client didn't sign anything after all, and so the company lost $200 million. Then Oliver asked Tony what was going on. The hero mentioned that his buddy dropped a couple of messages in the study chat. Oliver was surprised that they even had such a chat. Then Tony reminded him about the group from the training center, saying they set up a chat for everyone who was in the strategic planning department. He then asked if Oliver remembered Tony and their teams, and Oliver's face instantly showed a hint of anger, telling him not to even start about that guy because he's just awful. At that moment, the hero recalled the day he ran into his namesake. He approached him and asked what the problem was. In response, Tony just asked to be left alone. Then Oliver asked if Samantha was in that chat. Tony said she was, and asked why he wanted to know. Oliver's face turned red, and he said she's really beautiful and smart, then asked to be added to the chat too. The hero said he'd ask the others about it and add him if they have no objections. Then Oliver stood up from his desk and declared that all the drinks were on him. The next day, the guys headed back to work at the company. Kimberly told them that at the very bottom of their company's website, they would find videos listing the criteria for staff selection, and their task today was to review these videos, and next week they would go public. She asked them to think about what they needed to prepare and check. The guys told her she could count on them. At that moment, the phone didn't ring again. When he picked up the phone, he saw it was Marvin, the manager's assistant, calling, but he couldn't figure out why he was calling at such an hour. He picked up the phone and whispered a greeting. Then Marvin was yelling, saying that he had been causing problems since day one, and today he didn't even show up at the event without any notice. Then Tony said that he was at work. Apparently Marvin had called the wrong Tony. The guy apologized for mixing up the numbers, then mentioned that this dude really gets on his nerves. Then he decided to ask his buddy which department he's working in now. Tony said he's in HR now, so Marvin suggested they should catch up later. The man was super annoyed that his coworker wasn't picking up the phone, so he just decided to call his home number. Meanwhile, the story moves to the cottage of Elsung Group's director, Christopher. In the middle of the day, his phone suddenly rang. He picked up and asked who was calling. It was Marvin. He wished the man a good morning and said he was the manager's assistant at the company where Tony works. Christopher asked why he was calling. Then Marvin explained that Tony hadn't shown up for work today, so he was checking if something had happened to keep him away. Christopher said things were calm, and then he double-checked if Tony really didn't show up for work. Marvin said he got a warning for his behavior yesterday, and today he was worried it might be related. Christopher asked the man his name again. Then Marvin reintroduced himself. The boss said he didn't know where he was either, but he'd try to call him and tell him to get in touch. Marvin apologized for the trouble and thanked him for the help. Right before Christopher hung up, he heard the manager's voice on the phone asking where Tony was, but Marvin said his relatives didn't know either. The guy said they need to fire that dude ASAP. He's refusing to come to work just because he got lectured about his behavior for blowing a $200 million contract. Turns out, Christopher heard the whole conversation. When he realized what happened, he immediately cursed at his grandson. The man's secretary asked if he was having any trouble. That's when Christopher yelled, telling his secretary to call the VP and order him to drag his kid in within an hour. The guy decided to ask what the rush was all about. Christopher just said he didn't need a reason. The secretary should just start making calls right now. 3 hours had passed since then. The company was buzzing with activity, but Tony was having some trouble. He was staring at a form written in English. At that moment, Connor came over and asked if there were any issues with the resume. Tony awkwardly scratched the back of his head, admitting his English wasn't all that great. Connor told him he didn't need to be fluent. Basic English would do, but Tony explained that his English was just terrible. Connor asked how many points he scored on the test, hoping the answer would be around 800 or 900. But Tony said he only got 500 because the test didn't take into account his skills in documenting speeches. So Connor asked him to send over the file, saying he'd handle the resume himself. But he warned Tony that he needed to brush up on his English if he wanted to keep working at the company. After work, they headed to the store to pick up some English textbooks, but he didn't know which book to start with. Suddenly, he spotted a book titled English for Business and figured it would be a good choice. The book cost 18,001. Soon evening came, and our heroes returned to their apartment. He tried to study English using the book he just bought. However, he was really frustrated by the fact that everything he wrote down was hard to remember. He has no trouble understanding politics, economics, and the news, but language just doesn't stick. Maybe because he's only good at memorizing. Then the system suggested he check out the exclusive goods store. Among them was a starter pack for learning Arabic, Portuguese, Korean skills, and perfumery. The system also notified that the store update was just 7 days away. Tony thought maybe an English skill would pop up later, but he had no clue how to gather enough points. The system suggested he try some available mini-quests, but our hero was too tired and decided to think it over after some solid sleep. The next day, he headed back to the company's main office. Kimberly was busy as ever with her work. That's when Tony blinked, deciding to activate his skill. He needed to look at a person or object for more than 10 seconds, and then the required mini-quest would appear. At that moment, a system notification appeared above Kimberly's head, reporting that her computer had been showing the blue screen of death off and on, so Tony needed to ask for permission to fix her software. So Tony approached her and mentioned he heard her computer had been freezing a lot these past few days. The girl asked why he suddenly brought it up. Tony didn't mention his suspicion about the updates, so he just asked her if he could check out her computer since he's used to act the same way. She let him do it since she had to leave for a morning briefing anyway. Tony told her she could count on him. Soon after, he started updating her computer, which was almost done. Then he went to Connor, telling him he heard he decided to quit smoking, so he brought him some candies to make it easier, and the guy asked him how he knew since he just decided today. The hero smirked, saying a little bird told him, and then wished the manager good luck. Connor thanked him for the candies and the words of support. After that, the system notified him that the mini-quest was completed, and now Tony had 4 points, so he wondered if there were any additional quests. He turned his head to the side, hoping to see the system window there. Then he turned his head the other way. However, when he realized there were no more quests, he got pretty upset. Just then, a man walked into the office. It was the HR department's general manager, Jordan. He asked if anything big had happened while he was away. Connor said everything was stable. Then they asked how his vacation went. But Jordan noticed the new guys and asked, "Who are these guys?" Tony immediately approached him and greeted him, saying he was the new guy and would do his best. Then Oliver greeted him too. Jordan was surprised because Oliver had initially applied to the strategic planning department, and it kind of bummed him out since none of the new hires had deliberately gone into HR. Connor then said they hadn't hired anyone specifically so they could pick someone from those applying to strategic planning. Jordan remarked that when you think about it, they never got new employees straight after boot camp. He felt like Connor and Kimberly had just decided to stay in their department yesterday, even though they had applied for planning. Time flew by so fast. After their stint in HR under the planning department's program, if the guys realize they like it here better, they should let Jordan know because HR might turn out to be better than planning. Oliver couldn't believe his ears. Could he really stay here instead of going into strategic planning? Jordan added that this isn't a place where they can just stay because they want to. Everything will depend on their work performance. Meanwhile, the story shifts back to Director Christopher's house, where even from the street you could hear him yelling about how he asked the guys to show up half an hour ago. He asked Tony why it took him so long and why he hadn't been showing up at work. The guy said he got held up at a friend's birthday party and apologized to his grandpa. Christopher asked if he really thought that was a good excuse. Then Tony bowed again, asking his grandpa for forgiveness. That's when Christopher grabbed his phone and started making a call. Turns out he was calling HR. Tony picked up the phone, asking how he could help. Christopher introduced himself, saying he was the chairman. At first, Tony couldn't believe that the chairman of Elsung Group was actually calling him. Kimberly and Jordan were pretty shocked too. Then Christopher asked to transfer Tony to the company's construction department. The hero mentioned that he was currently in the HR department and asked if the chairman really wanted him moved to another department. Then Christopher clarified that he was talking about his grandson and asked again to transfer him to construction. The hero said he would definitely do it, and before he could ask if the chairman needed anything else, the man hung up. Jordan asked him if the chairman really had called him. The hero said the chairman wants him to transfer Tony from life insurance to construction. Jordan asked why this happened so suddenly and why he called him personally. Kimberly explained that Tony is the chairman's grandson. Jordan couldn't believe his ears. He wasn't fully convinced that it was about the codename SSS. That's when they finally realized that the guy from the training center was the director's grandson. Meanwhile, Tony dropped to his knees, begging his granddad to forgive him. Christopher said there was no need to apologize to him. He was going to transfer his grandson to an overseas branch anyway, to work on a construction site in the Middle East for a year. Maybe the desert heat would knock some sense into him. Tony couldn't believe his grandpa was actually sending him to the desert. Then he said he would definitely shape up and never make such a mistake again. They just needed to forget all about it this time. He fell at his grandpa's feet, pleading to be left here, saying he really hated sand. Then Christopher kicked him, calling him a pathetic fool. The kick was strong enough that Tony flew back onto the floor. At that moment, a secretary came over and helped him get up. Christopher said that the guy didn't help him because his grandson didn't deserve any help. The secretary had no choice but to get fixed up. Then he left the room with Christopher. He asked the man to tell the bosses they were skipping lunch breaks due to delays. Tony was left sitting alone in the room. Once everyone was gone, he suddenly started crying. Soon the next day came, and the heroes went back to work in the HR team. He mentioned that they received forms for annual leave this month and asked Kimberly to let him distribute them since he had nothing else to do. The girl said that if he wanted to do that, she would be more than happy. So the hero got to work. To herself, the girl noted that Tony is a person who seeks out and completes tasks on his own. Then she noticed that Oliver had stepped out for another smoke break. Seems like he's doing that a lot lately. At that moment, Tony spotted a mistake in the documents, called someone up, and mentioned that there was an error in the form, so he wanted to ask for permission to fix it. The person on the other end thanked the young man for his attentiveness. Right then, a man in a suit and glasses walked into the office. Tony immediately stood up, greeted the man, and asked how he could help him. The man said he was Donald from the University Employment Support Team. there to discuss a business collaboration, and asked where he could find manager Connor. Tony told him that Connor had just stepped out but would be back soon, and offered for him to wait on the couch. Donald sat down on the couch and started browsing something on his phone. Kimberly was getting anxious because the manager wasn't coming back and was making the client wait. Tony noticed this too, so he made Donald a cup of coffee and told him that they had informed the manager and he would arrive in 10 minutes. Donald thanked him for being vigilant and for the coffee. Kimberly let out a sigh of relief, glad that Tony was there. Otherwise, she would have had to do all the work herself. Soon after, Oliver entered the room. He sprayed his clothes, hoping to get rid of the tobacco smell. Kimberly thought to herself that he wasn't putting much effort into his work. Shortly after him, Connor walked into the room, greeted Donald, and mentioned that Donald didn't need to come in person, but still thanked him for making the trip. Donald said that Connor is a contractor and he's a subcontractor, so he had to come. He asked the man when the job fair at the university would be. Connor suggested that they should schedule the meeting during the holidays since active hiring starts in the latter half of the year, around August. So they need to push things forward without delay. Donald mentioned that students should always be thinking about their careers, because it's up to them whether they end up working for this company or not. Before leaving, he apologized for taking them away from their work and suggested they talk outside. But first, he needed to use the restroom. Connor said he'd be waiting for him. Before leaving the office, he called out to Tony. He thanked the guy for letting him know about the client's arrival since he completely forgot he had a meeting today. Tony said he was the one who should be thanking him. Soon after that, he got back to work. Just then, someone called the office. Kimberly picked up and mentioned that she heard the part the boss talked about wasn't mentioned. That's when Tony realized he should handle this call. He grabbed his phone and joined the conversation. He introduced himself and said he was covering for Connor at the moment. Turned out it was Christopher calling, asking to send someone to his office right away. Tony said the request would be handled right away. Then Kimberly asked him who that was. Tony told her that the chairman asked him to come up. Apparently he was about to call Connor, but since he's busy, Tony should go instead. Then Kimberly asked who picked up the phone, and Tony said it was him. The girl said that in that case, he should listen to him. After that, Tony headed to the elevator. It was his first call from the chairman, and he was a bit nervous. Soon, he arrived at the right floor where a receptionist greeted him. She asked how she could help, and Tony said he was from HR there on the chairman's call. The receptionist called the chairman, asked if he called someone from HR, and then Christopher told her to let him in. After that, the girl smiled and said Tony could come in. When our hero entered the office, he saw his namesake kneeling before Christopher, who was yelling at him about definitely sending him abroad. Tony was begging for forgiveness this time. Then, the hero caught everyone's attention by saying that the chairman had called for him. His namesake, still on his knees, was confused about what was happening. The hero didn't really like the vibe in that room. Then Christopher told Tony to go with his grandson to the airport, buy him a plane ticket, personally see him off on a flight to the Middle East, and not to come back until he had gained some decent work experience. Tony begged his grandfather again, pleading for his forgiveness. That's when his father intervened, saying that Tony was the chairman's grandson and he deserved a pardon. Then Christopher pondered whether he should really forgive him again. Images from the past, from the year 1970, flashed before his eyes again. A woman stood on the pier, shouting a boy's name with tears streaming down her face. Soon, a man approached her and she said she couldn't find him. The man tried to calm her down, telling her not to worry because they would definitely find him. It turned out, their 5-year-old child was missing. And the woman said she wanted to die because she saw no reason to live without her son. After that, the story shifts to an orphanage 2 years later. As it turned out, the couple couldn't find their child, so they decided to adopt another baby. They promised to take good care of him and raise him as their own. That's when Christopher thought about how troubles seemed to follow this man ever since he appeared, and he was just furious. So he turned to Tony, and both guys thought the chairman was talking to them. He said that Tony could head back because of the HR department. The hero said he got it and left the office. Then Christopher turned to his grandson. He said the guy who just left was top of the list. Then asked his grandson what he thinks when he sees him. But Tony just hung his head, not knowing what to say. Christopher said you can tell by that guy that he really puts a lot of effort into his work, so he doesn't have to be jealous of anyone. He achieves amazing heights, probably works so hard he only sleeps a couple of hours a day. He said that guy is the team captain, and his grandson is just a cheerleader, then asked what his rank was in the top. Tony's dad immediately grimaced when he heard that question. Christopher said he was at the very bottom, yet he's supposed to inherit this company, and he doesn't even show up for work. So Tony said he realized his mistake and asked for another chance, promising he'd work his butt off. Tony's dad apologized to the chairman, saying he'd raise him better and make sure he wouldn't mess up again. He spoke to him as his only son, mentioned that Tony was his only grandson and that he should be a bit lenient. Christopher pondered his words. Then he said he'd give him one last chance. Tony instantly lit up and thanked his granddad for the opportunity. Christopher said the chance was from him, not his company, since Tony had screwed up big time here, so he needed to find a job somewhere else. Meanwhile, the story shifts back to the HR department. To everyone's surprise, Tony, the chairman's grandson, walked into the office. The hero asked what brought him here. He said the chairman asked for his transfer to another division, so he came here for Tony to move him to Seoul. The next day, Samantha told our hero that Tony, the chairman's grandson, had transferred to their department. The hero wasn't too happy that they were laughing at his name again. So he asked the girl what that guy had done this time. She said an elderly couple came into their store and spent 30 minutes flipping channels, looking like they were about to watch a movie. Then Tony walked up to the couple and told them to get out if they weren't planning to buy anything. After that, they went to the information desk and complained about him, saying the new employees had no manners, which led Samantha and the entire staff to be called together, apparently to get a lecture about not being rude to customers. Tony couldn't believe this guy was causing trouble again on his first day in the new department. Sometime later, he messed up again during a conference. He said he'd step out to the restroom for a minute but never came back, leaving everyone stunned by his behavior. Soon it was Saturday, and the story moves to a church. Turns out Hannah did accept Hank's proposal, and they decided to tie the knot. They even invited Tony to their wedding. Tony noticed his mom was wearing a wig, and she asked if it looked too weird on her. Tony told her it just looked unusual, but she herself looked stunning, and he would always support her. He also hoped she'd find happiness with Hank. Soon the wedding ceremony started in the church, and the pastor showed up to marry them. He wished their love would grow and their relationship would flourish. Tony pointed out that it was a wedding with just one guest, but that's exactly what his mom and Hank wanted. Hank vowed to give his all to the marriage, just like when he first confessed his long-held feelings. Hannah agreed to give all her love to her husband, as heaven doesn't often give a second chance to find your soulmate. Then the pastor suggested they should seal the ceremony with a kiss. After that, Hannah and Hank kissed. After a while, they showed up at the pastor's office. The man greeted them with a smile and said he thought Hank would stay single forever. Hank thanked him for taking the time to make the ceremony official and said they now owe him one. The man said it was no big deal since he's about to retire soon anyway. Then Hank smiled, saying there are a bunch of people who rely on him. But the pastor said he doesn't think the clergy would approve of someone as mediocre as him sealing the second marriage. Hannah objected, saying the man was a benefactor to her as well. The pastor chuckled, said he wasn't much of a benefactor, but thanked her for the kind words and then asked what they were planning to do next. The couple said they wanted to visit the cemetery where Hannah's former husband, Howard, is buried. The pastor was quite surprised by that response. Hank said they should stop by his place first before heading anywhere. The pastor sighed, not understanding how someone who was supposed to outlive them all could leave this world so soon. Soon after, Hannah, Hank, and Tony headed to the cemetery, where Hank told the guy that long before his father met his mother, he had paid for his medical school. Hannah was surprised to hear this fact. Then Hank explained that they had to leave the orphanage at 20, with only enough state money for the first few months, and medical school was expensive. So Howard really helped him out with the payments back then. Hank was surprised he had never told them about this. Hannah said he always mentioned that they were just good friends and nothing more. Then Tony wondered how his father was doing now. Soon they arrived at the cemetery. Hank knelt by Howard's grave and said that he had married Hannah. He said it seemed like even the heavens wished them a happy life. But the doctor said that Hannah was completely cured of cancer, and now Howard would have to support their new life. Hannah burst into tears, saying that before he died, he asked her to keep living happily, and she promised she would. She'd raise Tony and take good care of him, trying to enjoy each day as long as he supported them. To himself, Tony thought he'd do everything he could to make his dad proud of him. Then he thanked him for everything. Later, the hero mentioned it was time for him to leave, but his mom asked him to stay and have dinner together before he went. But Tony said they needed to get ready for the honeymoon, and he'd just be in the way. He said goodbye to his mom and Hank and asked them to take care of themselves. On Monday morning, he was back at the company for work. He brought a spare amplifier just in case. Connor greeted him in the parking lot and asked if he was ready. Tony said he had loaded the microphone amplifier and 3 pens. Connor told him not to smile so much. The job and employment conference might seem fun, especially since it's his first event, but they had a tight schedule. They needed to run it at several universities. Then they'd see if Tony could still smile at the end of the day. Soon they arrived at Sovan University. Tony tried to set up the microphone. He asked Oliver, who was helping him, if he could be heard. Oliver said he could hear him loud and clear. Then Tony asked him to go to the other side and check the sound there, suspecting some feedback might be happening. Oliver went to the other side, but he didn't understand what feedback meant. Then, to his surprise, he said he could hear Tony's voice twice. The hero explained that's what feedback means, then mentioned that he needed to adjust something on the amplifiers and asked him to wait a second as he needed to check the volume settings. Oliver chuckled, saying there's nothing Tony can't handle. While the hero was adjusting the equalizer, he reflected on how past experience is always useful. Then he decided to test the microphone again. He asked Oliver if the sound had gotten any better. Oliver said that there were no more background noises now. So the hero said that in that case, he could go down. At that moment, Connor entered the room and asked if everything was ready. Tony said they had set up everything from the computer, video files, sound systems, microphones to arranging the entrance and exit so the conference could start. Connor smiled and said that it was quite an impressive setup. Soon, students arrived for the conference, and Connor welcomed them, saying that today there would be an informational conference about job opportunities at Elsung Group. He mentioned that this was their second visit to their university, the last one being a year ago, and he already recognized some familiar faces. Kimberly asked those who were here last year to raise their hands. One of those who raised their hand was a student in glasses and a green t-shirt. Then the girl said she remembered him and asked if he wanted to join the company in the first half of the year. The guy didn't mention that he had applied before but failed the screening this year during the recruitment period. He wants to apply again. The girl said that it's tough with the paperwork the first time, but she wished him luck next time. Then Connor said if they didn't make it through the paperwork stage, it must mean someone else scored higher on additional skills. Starting this year, the English test won't be mandatory. These results will count as extra skills, and bonus points will be given for the test to keep things fair. Work experience, even if unrelated to their field, will also be an advantage. So, it's important to keep track of certain things that will help with gathering enough equivalence. That's when the guy realized he didn't make it for that exact reason. He needed to leverage any extra achievements he could. Oliver said that the seniors are quite experienced. They really work well as a team. When the conference was over, Connor said it was time to pack up their gear and head back to the company. After that, all 4 of them headed back to the office. He mentioned that the manager wants to entrust the conference to the newcomers this week. Kimberly was surprised. She thought they were too green to be given such a task. Connor said it seems like the manager wants to test them in the conference room before moving forward, and the results will definitely impact the assessment that goes to the strategic planning department. Then Tony said he'd get everything ready by tomorrow, and Oliver said he'd do the same. However, he was surprised that this check came upon them so suddenly. The next day, Tony headed to the HR department's conference room. Jordan asked who wanted to go first. Then Connor said that since Tony is younger than Oliver, they should start with the juniors. The hero was surprised, seeing as going first didn't offer him any advantages. Then Oliver raised his hand, saying he'd like to start. Tony was surprised by his initiative. At first, he thought he misheard. Turns out, just before this, Connor said he'd make sure Tony went first so Oliver could get more prep time. He mentioned that the second guy would have an advantage and he couldn't just overlook someone who took out a loan for their education, because some places are just not meant for everyone. Oliver kept quiet. He didn't know what to say. As it turned out, Tony was eavesdropping on their conversation. Then Jordan said that they have a set order, and the elders should give way, so now it's Oliver's turn to perform. Oliver mentioned that in the second half of the year, they're hiring 300 people to first check the documents, and of course, preparing resumes comes first, followed by extra points. Kimberly noted that his presentation had a good start and his breathing was steady. However, the presentation was a bit dull. Nothing really grabs your attention, and his voice sounded quite monotonous. Seems like Jordan noticed that too. He stopped Oliver, saying that was enough, and then said it was Tony's turn now. The heroes stood up from their seats and introduced themselves, saying that before they get to the main point, he'd like to pretend that everyone in the room are students at the university they'll visit next time. Jordan noted to himself that he got off to a pretty good start. Then Tony turned to the chart, saying their company is at the top of the rankings for a reason. He said that no other company can match their performance because they are, without exaggeration, the best in Korea. Next, he asked them to raise their hands if they were really interested in applying for a job at Elsung Group. Kimberly raised her hand, stating that she was interested. Then Tony turned to Oliver, telling him it was time to hand out the gifts the company had prepared for the students, wanting to give them to all conference participants. Oliver was surprised, asking if he really wanted him to do that right now. Jordan remarked that it was a pretty engaging way to present. Then Tony decided to explain why they should choose their company, saying that to keep up with the era of globalization, the company is focusing on 6 key projects. First off, their electronics branch is developing a new growth mechanism using OLED panels. Kimberly noted that he's really good at it. His speech makes you want to apply, showing the company's future prospects. Connor also pointed out his compelling voice, focused on facts, and moreover, he's worked on the visuals for the slides. Jordan thought this guy is doing great, even better than Connor and Kimberly's assistant. Then Connor suddenly stopped him, clarifying that Tony doesn't speak English that well. He then said, imagine he's a foreigner asking him something in English, then asked what Tony would do in that situation. Our hero didn't lose his cool and turned to Oliver for help again. Oliver was surprised that they wanted him to do something again. So he asked him to go to Mr. Connor and explain the hiring details to him in English. Jordan was extremely pleased with this way of solving the problem. Kimberly laughed, noting how cleverly he had handled the situation. Then Connor thought that the winner was pretty much decided already. Tony asked the manager if he should keep going. Then Jordan said that was enough for today and thanked the guy for the great job. Soon, there was another job fair at the university hosted by Elsung Group. This time, Tony was speaking. He asked the students to come closer because the conference was starting in 5 minutes. Connor noted that there was a big turnout today. Donald said that Elsung Group is one of the biggest companies in Korea, and obviously people were interested to hear about it. When the conference started, Tony introduced himself, saying he worked in HR and that he would be leading today's session. Donald was pleasantly surprised that this guy was in charge of the conference today. Then Connor explained that he was a new employee at their company. Donald said he looked like a pro, so he wasn't surprised that he was so kind and respectful that day. Connor said it wasn't quite like that, since Tony didn't graduate from a prestigious university, and his English was pretty basic. He figured the job at the company wasn't for him. However, Donald disagreed, saying that these days, the prestige of a university isn't valued as highly as it used to be. Instead, competent people are recognized by the respect and recognition they receive at such an age. Then Tony decided to start the conference, asking the students if anyone knew the 3 qualities the company looks for in new employees. But the students didn't know the answer to that question. Then Tony said that those qualities are enthusiasm, ethics, and innovative thinking. Their company is looking for people who start their work with passion, those who aren't limited by past beliefs, and can push the company into an innovative future. However, during the work process, it's important not to abandon your values and principles, as these qualities apply to everyone present. Then one of the students raised his hand, intending to ask a question. Tony immediately gave him the chance to speak. The guy said he heard that graduates from rural universities who applied to the company didn't pass the document check. He wanted to know if this was true, and if not, what the hiring conditions were. Tony didn't know how to answer that question since it was his first time hearing about it. When it came to hiring new employees, he said it was a blind process that didn't consider your university major. He mentioned he studied using a banking system of academic credits, and they still hired him. Hearing this, the students were thrilled. They figured they should give submitting their documents a shot, too. Then another student decided to speak up. He said he'd been applying to the company for 3 years, even though he had already graduated, and still hadn't passed the paperwork check. He questioned if they really hired blindly and how they could be sure they weren't being lied to. Oliver responded that the guy was being pretty rough in his approach. Then Tony said that was true. And since this guy had been trying with the company for 3 years, it could be assumed he was older than Tony himself. Tony mentioned that he started working in construction as a carpenter at 20. He said any work experience is important, anything that shows you have the qualities the company is looking for in its employees. Then the student said he had prepared for employment, so he got a license. Tony told him that in that case, he should make good use of his time. The document check focuses on the life candidates have led up to now, as described in their resumes, and having a license is pretty common. Then the student asked what he should prepare in that case. Tony said he needs to prepare a resume that describes his lifestyle and experiences he's been through, as well as his personality, and the company will consider every detail of the resume. He said now's the time to question how to show your strength to make the cut. That's when the student realized why he was getting rejected. Each time he decided he should revisit his resume and add a few points. Donald noted that the guy gave the right advice because the resume is the first thing they look at during selection. Connor agreed, saying it sums up the candidate's entire life. He remembered an incident that happened 4 months ago when he approached Kimberly and asked why she had set aside some applications. The girl said that those applications mentioned Tony, codename SSS, which stands for the Vice President's Son. Connor thought about how his resume must be really busy, describing how he got into the field, his work there, his values and beliefs, all looking pretty decent. The girl said that on the other hand, that guy's resume from abroad was just terrible, filled with one-word sentences and utterly insincere. Connor said that must be the SSS guy. He figured the vice president is raising his son in humble conditions. Then he recalled an incident from 2 months ago. Connor asked the girl if the vice president's son wasn't really the top priority. Kimberly said it wasn't him. He was at the bottom of the list, while the guy who wrote a good resume ended up in first place. At first, Connor couldn't believe that a guy with just a credit-based education got to the top spot. But the girl suggested he might have a lot of work experience despite his not-so-great education. Now, Connor figured his opinion might have changed somewhat. Donald asked him what he meant by that. Meanwhile, Tony kept the conference going, saying they hire experienced workers, making it even easier to join the company, so they shouldn't view the newbie program as the only option. He mentioned that there wasn't much time left, so the students should make the most of it. One of the students said he'd think of this as his last chance and consider other companies as well. Tony smirked, said you shouldn't talk so openly about other companies, but he'd pretend he never heard that. The guy awkwardly apologized for his words. Connor said that Tony is very competent and easy to talk to. He had been biased against him because of his education. Then Donald laughed, saying he still has a lot to learn since education isn't the sole measure of a person. Connor agreed, saying that after all, his life was just beginning. After the conference, Oliver approached his partner and asked how he was feeling, since that guy was pretty rough. But the hero said he was fine, just tired. He said he understood that guy, mentioning that he had tried to fit into the company for 3 whole years, and if he were in Tony's shoes, his reaction would have been the same. Oliver said he wasn't like those guys, but Tony admitted he was really desperate to get that job. He had been doing physical labor, which was really tough, and on top of that, his mom was sick. At that moment, Connor walked in and asked if they were done with the conference. Then Tony said that was it for today, and they should head to the next place. As everyone stepped outside, they said goodbye to Donald. and the man told them to keep up the good work as they had done a great job. As they got into the car, Donald waved to them. To himself, he thought that Connor was really still just a kid. A few days later, Jordan was sorting through papers. He consulted with the assistant manager on who to give the evaluation points to, Tony or Oliver, as he couldn't decide since his opinion was quite relative. Connor said it all depends on the manager himself. Then Jordan asked if he recommended Oliver just because he studied abroad. Then Connor said they should rate Tony the highest since he's better. Jordan mentioned that he's a very competent worker, but his education isn't impressive. Then Connor said they live in times when that's not so important. He's smart and capable, and they should support him in this. Jordan agreed with him, saying he thought the same thing. 2 weeks have passed since then. One workday, Oliver came up to Tony and asked what he was looking at. At that time, the hero was entering some data somewhere. He said he was about to check something. He was interested in the results of his English test. Oliver asked, "Age or the scores from last time?" Tony said he scored 705 points. He studied for a whole month and only managed to score an extra 180 points, and he was really upset about it. However, Oliver was shocked. He couldn't understand how someone could improve their scores so much in just 1 month. At that moment, Connor walked into the office. Noticing Tony's odd expression, he asked what happened. Then Oliver said that Tony scored 705 on English and was unhappy that his results only went up by 180 points in a month. Connor smirked, saying that apparently his limited English knowledge wouldn't be a problem anymore. Tony said he still wasn't good enough, but he would try to work even harder. Then Connor turned to him, asking him to stay in their HR department. However, Tony didn't say that his goal was to get into the strategic planning department. Connor said they were thinking about adding another person to their team, and the boss had recommended him, and he agreed. Oliver was surprised to hear that there was a vacancy in HR, and he was offering it to Tony. Connor said he can't say HR is better than strategic planning, but they climb the career ladder faster than other departments, sometimes even getting called in for a chat with the company head, which helps them keep tabs on the bosses. However, Tony apologized, saying he'd prefer to prioritize strategic planning, even if it means losing a spot in HR. Connor said he was sorry to hear that, but he didn't want to pressure him about his decision and asked if he was sure because he didn't want him to regret it later. Tony thanked him for the offer, but he knew he couldn't accept it. Connor said that's fine, and if he doesn't want to stay, there's nothing you can do about it. Oliver was a bit upset that Connor hadn't offered him the position. Then Connor went back to Jordan and told him that Tony had turned down his offer. Jordan was surprised that he declined, despite saying he'd take him on. He mentioned that he'd made the offer twice, but Tony was firm on moving to strategic planning. Jordan said it seems like they were the only ones who paid him any mind. Couldn't understand how someone with no English skills was so keen on planning. Then asked Connor if he had rejected him before or after finding out he needed at least 700 points on the business English exam. Connor sighed wearily and said that he'd already scored 705 points this month, so he didn't think they could change his mind. That same evening, the HR department decided to organize a team dinner. Jordan praised all his employees, saying they had done a great job. Then he turned to Tony, saying he was really lucky because he had offered him to stay in the department, but then reluctantly gave him 5 points and let him go. Tony said he was sorry, but in the strategic planning department, he could fully utilize the skills he had acquired here. Then the manager turned to Oliver, asking if he was upset about scoring lower than Tony. Oliver said he wasn't upset. He knows he's not as good as him, so it's all good. Jordan said that this score wouldn't affect the overall performance rating. They were just tracking the development processes of the strategic planning department candidates. However, Oliver didn't understand what he meant. Kimberly explained that the manager was asking if he wanted to stay in HR, as they wanted to know if Oliver was ready to take the spot Tony had turned down. At first, Oliver couldn't believe his ears. Tony thought to himself that it was a great decision, seeing as Oliver was eager to stay here. Jordan said that since Oliver was drunk now, they would continue the discussion tomorrow. He mentioned that people could leave or stay if they wished, but the important thing was to work hard, wherever they were. Then he decided to make a toast to that and let go of all his worries. When the evening came to an end, Tony and Oliver headed home together, with Oliver suggesting they have one more drink. But Tony insisted that he was drunk and shouldn't drink anymore. Despite all of Oliver's requests, he stood his ground and refused to have another drink with him. Soon after, they decided to sit down and rest on a bench, and then Oliver said he had something to tell him. Tony suggested they talk about it tomorrow since Oliver was too drunk. However, Oliver ignored him, saying that sometimes he feels inadequate compared to Tony. The hero asked why he felt this way, given he studied abroad and his qualifications were way better. Then Oliver said it made no sense because all the glory still went to him, and he doubted he'd ever make it to the planning department at this rate. Then Tony suggested they all head home since Oliver could barely talk. Oliver said he'd stay in HR and get promoted faster than Tony, but the hero didn't get what he meant by that. He asked Tony to give it his all so he wouldn't have to eat the dust he'll kick up since they joined at the same time. They'd never stop competing, and it would stay that way until he left the company. Hearing this, the hero smiled and said Oliver could do his best, and he'd go all out wherever he went. And then they'd meet at the top of the business ladder, trying to climb up to assistant managers, then directors, and eventually executive directors. Oliver promised he'd never lose to him. Tony promised him the same thing. A few days later, Tony was invited to a conference in the strategic planning department hall. Albert asked if all the candidates who applied had shown up here. All 4 guys confirmed everyone was accounted for. Albert mentioned he heard that Oliver decided to stay in HR, so today they've got a new guy joining them, and everyone should give him a warm welcome. Hearing this, Tony was really surprised. Just then, the office door swung open and a young man walked in. Turns out it was Tony, the president's grandson. He waved to everyone there and greeted them.